Chapter 497. However, he now realized that he had perhaps underestimated the Northern Dipper organization. It was evident that he was unaware about the entirety of their sources. This was obviously dependent on Yi Shiwen since he was trying to collect those medicinal ingredients by himself. So, it would be very difficult for him to be on par with an organization's speed if he had tried to search them on his pace alone. However, you must know that the organization won't give you these things for free. The Wood Dragon laughed mischievously and said, it will cost you 5,000 points. However, the organization wants to give you a choice since you've entered the organization recently and don't have accumulated points. The organization can give you these things as long as you complete a task. However, we won't force you. The choice is yours. Yi Shiwen smiled wryly. Did he have any other option in this situation? Chao Yuyu's declaration of war had become an urgent matter for him. One mustn't consider the remaining 10 years' time as a long period of time. 10 years' time wasn't too much for these cultivators. It would pass within the wink of an eye. So, not much time was left for Yi Shiwen. And, the Northern Dipper organization certainly had a reputation that they didn't force their members to receive the tasks. However, what if they would offer a task in a situation when one couldn't refuse it? Not refusing would mean as good as accepting the task. The most important thing for Yi Shiwen was to enter the Sage Realm. And, it should be mentioned that he had been thinking mostly about this matter of late. What's the task? Yi Shiwen asked. He didn't think much. In fact, he couldn't even afford too many thoughts at present. He would plan about further progress only after he had entered the Sage Realm. His foundation was extremely solid and deep. However, this had also strengthened his thresholds beyond the required degree. So, it would be impossible for him to break the next threshold by merely the impact of his words alone, even after a span of 10 years. The thing is that some people have been chasing one of our subordinate members in order to kill him. They are looking for him everywhere. He must be found and rescued, the Wood Dragon spoke up while smiling mischievously. Which member? Yi Shiwen asked. He knew a bit about the Northern Dipper organization. He knew that it was an outstanding organization. The leader of the Northern Dipper organization was called Big Dipper Lord if the rumors were to be trusted. However, nobody had ever seen the Big Dipper Lord. There were 7-star officers underneath him. And then, there were another 14 Constellation members. And, all of them were considered as official members of the Northern Dipper organization. There were many reserved Constellation members as well. After that, there were the supporting members under these official members, and so on. It was certainly an incomparably huge organization. And, this was because of the sheer number of those supporting members. In fact, the Northern Dipper organization would have been a small organization if those supporting members were to be excluded. One of our saboteurs is in the meteor world. The smile on the face of the Wood Dragon seemed restrained as he said. Your saboteur is in the meteor world? Yi Shiwen asked. The meteor world was undoubtedly meteor sect's territory. Therefore, the other forces couldn't enter that place very easily. Moreover, it wasn't that easy to send a saboteur there either. He. You don't ask this from me. I haven't joined the organization far earlier than you either. So, I don't know about a lot of things either. It will sound unpleasant, but you also know that we Constellation members are mere goons who have been hired by the higher-ups to do the things they don't wish to do themselves, the Wood Dragon said. Yi Shiwen was rendered speechless. But, this was genuinely the case. He had joined with the Northern Dipper organization very recently. However, it didn't mean that he didn't know anything about them. The Big Dipper Lord was at the top position in the Northern Dipper organization. And, those 7-star officers were his direct subordinates. But, the Constellation members were basically hired goons. They had powerful strength. They used to unceasingly complete tasks and get whatever they required in return. These Constellation members might never get to see the true colors of the Northern Dipper organization. After all, a hired goon only needed to know what he was supposed to do. These constellation members were certainly called official members, but the fact was that they might not even know as much as those support members. And that's because those peripheral members were the true subordinates of the Northern Dipper organization. Whereas, these constellation members only used to work for the Northern Dipper organization to get whatever they needed from them in return. Who is this saboteur? Yi Shiwen asked. I don't know much. I only know that this saboteur was the prince of the Great Wei Empire in the meteor world. He was developed into a saboteur of our organization from an early age. The original position of the organization was to help him become the emperor. And then, they would slowly help him reach a high-level position in the meteor sect, the Wood Dragon explained. Yi Shiwen gasped. The Northern Dipper organization was very courageous. The meteor sect was a very reputed force. In fact, it could be compared with the true martial university of its most prosperous time. And, the Northern Dipper organization had dared to send one of their saboteurs there. He immediately realized that the Northern Dipper organization might also have a saboteur in the true martial university. In fact, the possibility was huge since each big force would position their saboteur in other forces to steal information. However, Yi Shiwen cast away these thoughts from his mind, and continued to listen to Wood Dragon. However, he rebelled afterwards. In fact, he was planning to leave the organization, the Wood Dragon continued, therefore, the higher-ups decided to teach him a lesson to show him his place. So, they've withdrawn the group of people who were sent there to back him up. Aren't you afraid of getting exposed? It won't be good for you if you have to face the meteor sect's wrath. Yi Shiwen asked. He. A big force like the meteor sect can't do anything to a force like ours. They will most likely turn a blind eye in this matter. Moreover, that prince is quite ambitious. And, he's not an idiot either. So, he won't let people find out about his relation with us. Otherwise, forget about acquiring the position of the emperor, even saving his own life will become an issue for him, the Wood Dragon laughed mischievously and said. However, his expression immediately became serious as he added, it doesn't concern us alone. It concerns you as well since you are also a member of our Northern Dipper organization now. Yi Shiwen nodded. He also thought that this was the right step. Every force had extremely harsh punishments for a traitor. In fact, these punishments could leave people to tremble with fear. This had been the case since ancient times. And, this was the same in any force. So, that prince wouldn't break his relationship with the Northern Dipper organization on his own accord unless he was an idiot. Moreover, even a formidable force like the meteor sect would be at a loss while dealing with an erratic force like the Northern Dipper organization since the latter was so elusive that even the location of its lair wasn't known to anyone. Therefore, even the power of the meteor sect wouldn't work since it would be like using an anti-aircraft gun to strike down a mosquito. And, that would also be very frustrating. So, it would be better for them to turn a blind eye in this matter. However, that prince suffered a defeat at the hands of other princes in a fight once we retracted our assistance. And, he's being chased down like a dog ever since, the Wood Dragon continued to explain, and, he has now recalled us. In fact, he's crying for help since people are looking for him everywhere. So, the organization has decided to send us there since we are the only ones suitable to go there. The meteor world isn't like the true martial world. In fact, a great sage expert would quickly get caught by them if he doesn't have any extraordinary method to hide his presence. A bunch of forces had risen abruptly in the true martial world after the true martial university's decline. And, the line of control of each force had crisscrossed with each other's. This had left behind many loopholes. And, the Wood Dragon could easily travel around through those loopholes. However, the meteor sect was different. They had extremely tight control over their territory. So, it wasn't easy to enter that place. Sage experts were undoubtedly very low-key when compared to the glamorous great sage experts. So, it wasn't easy to catch them. It will take more than 10 years to reach the meteor world from the true martial world by flying, and that too if we don't take any rest, eat, or drink anything in between. So, he would have been chopped into pieces by those people by the time we reach there. Yi Shiwen said. The true martial world was very far away from the meteor world. So, it would take a few years' time to reach there even if he were to unfold his devil wings and fly at his best speed. And, everything would be over by that time since that prince would have been chopped into pieces by then. Yi Shiwen clearly knew about the cruelty and brutality of the fights of these imperial clans. He had understood this because of his enmity with the 8th Prince Yue. We have an advantage. We can use the organization's hidden teleportation portal, the wood dragon smiled mischievously and said. They would quickly reach there with the help of portal. And, they wouldn't have to fly for more than 10 years in that case. Moreover, the universe was a very dangerous place. So, it would have been very depressing if they had died on their way there. Just the two of us will go there? Yi Shiwen asked. Of course. It's just a fight between the princes, that's all. So, sage experts will be enough to keep watch, the wood dragon replied. Wouldn't that emperor have been worried if our prince were to be very powerful? Yi Shiwen pondered over this matter for a moment. There's always a necessity of balance in power inside a force for its operations to be smooth. He then said, when we are leaving. It would be better if we leave immediately. The sooner, the better. I'm afraid that the boy who doesn't even know the profoundness of this world will get slaughtered, the wood dragon added in an eccentric manner. Okay. Let me say goodbye to my senior sister and senior brother. Only Yang Wenjun and Deng Shui Xian were present on the entire Hidden Star Peak apart from second sister who had been undergoing closed-door training and cultivating like a madman for many years. So, he would wish to inform them that he was leaving. This was the first time that Yi Shiwen would participate in a task as a member of the Northern Dipper organization. So, he took off his cyan-colored robe, and put on a white-colored robe in its place. It looked neat and refreshing. Yi Zaiwen's seniors only asked him to be careful, but they didn't ask where he was going since it wasn't necessary. They flew away into the starry sky after they came out of the true martial university. The Northern Dipper organization's teleportation portal was situated in the space since it would have been discovered very easily by others if it were to be set up on land. And, one could imagine what would have happened if people had discovered it. These are the medicinal ingredients that the organization has gathered. They had asked me to give these materials to you in advance if you agreed. I don't know which immortality pill you are planning to refine. However, it will obviously be helpful for us if your strength promotes. In fact, we could also complete this mission easily if your strength manages to increase. The wood dragon took out a cosmos sack, and threw it towards Yi Shiwen. The wood dragon could also see that these ingredients were materials required for alchemy. However, he couldn't tell which pill Yi Shiwen wanted to refine. Yi Shiwen swept out his divine sense, and confirmed that these were genuinely the same medicinal ingredients which he had wanted. He obviously became happy as a result. In fact, the Northern Dipper organization had suddenly grown to have this generous imagine in his mind. One could even say that he felt as if it was quite difficult for people to have ill intentions towards them. After all, these goons were also similar in that regard since they had agreed to get hired by the higher-ups so that they could take advantage of the Northern Dipper organization and vice versa. It was clearly visible that Northern Dipper organization possessed some high-handed management skills. The organization was quite relaxed. However, its cohesion clearly wasn't small. Chapter 498. Forces only used to give two things to their subordinates under normal circumstances, reward and punishment. Yi Shiwen had never come across the word punishment. However, he had already obtained too many rewards in the beginning itself. So, it was difficult for him to not have a good opinion regarding the Northern Dipper organization. He was obviously very excited after he obtained the medicinal ingredients. However, he became calm afterwards. He could refine the Break Sage Yellow Pill and make the breakthrough into the Sage Realm. The current situation was completely different from when he would make the breakthrough into the Sage Realm. Only the Sage experts were considered the top-notch experts in the true martial university's main force. He certainly did possess the Sage-level fighting strength at present. However, he only possessed the fighting strength of Sage Realm, and nothing more. His actual realm was still stuck in the late stage of the semi-sage realm. Moreover, his strength would advance by leaps and bounds once he'd make the breakthrough into the sage realm. In fact, even Qiao Yuyu wouldn't have the power to fight back once that would happen. Qiao Yuyu was a heaven's pride expert of his generation. So, his tyrannical strength had become even stronger with time. Plus, his realm was already far ahead of Yi Zaiwen's. He was about to enter the half-step Great Sage realm. He possessed unfathomable strength. Yi Shiwen took out the mask of the golden dragon of the neck, and put it on after they entered the space. It was a dragon mask. He soon found out that this mask had a special function: it could isolate the divine senses. Nobody could see his appearance under the mask as long as he had worn it. Only their Big Dipper Lord could recognize the members of their organization. In fact, the rest of the people may not come to know about the other members' appearance in their entire lifetime, since their identities were kept secret. This had been done to prevent the disturbance that might arise in the real lives of the members of the organization because of their identities. He looked at the wood dragon, who had also put on the mask of wood dragon of the horn. His facial features weren't visible. In fact, Yi Shiwen didn't even know wooden dragon's real names so far. The two of them had arrived in the vast space after having come out of true martial world's atmosphere. They then arrived in a desolate meteorite zone under the guidance of the wood dragon. There was a teleportation portal hidden among these countless and densely packed meteors. The wood dragon made a hand seal, and opened the portal. The two of them strode forward, and entered it. Then, they quickly disappeared inside this meteor field. The true martial world was situated extremely far away from the meteor world. Therefore, it took them almost half a month's time to reach the boundary of the meteor world, even though they had traveled via a teleportation portal. They would come out of one portal, and go into another. They had consequently traveled through various different channels in this half a month's time. There were channels of all sizes. And, it was hard to say how many portals they had to go through by the end of it. Finally, we have arrived. An expert below the Great Sage realm suffers a lot during interstellar travel. The wood dragon looked a little depressed as he spoke up. His voice sounded like a buzz as it passed through that dragon mask and came out. Great Sage Realm and Sage Realm were two entirely different stages. In fact, it was no big deal for Great Sage experts to touch the magical powers of Space Principle to such an extent that they could manipulate the size of space itself. And, this obviously came in handy during interstellar travel. That guy has given us so much trouble. I really wish to slap him to death. Wood Dragon waved his hand and made a slapping gesture. He had become very irritated after having switched portals for half a month. Let's go. It won't be beneficial for either of us if that guy gets chopped to pieces. Yi Shiwen opened his mouth and spoke. His voice sounded like the buzzing sound that's produced by the collision of gold and iron. They stealthily swept past the interstellar space on their rainbow lights. The meteor world had experts in abundance. In fact, their numbers here were even higher than the one inside the true martial world. They finally plunged into the atmosphere of the meteor world after they had flown for several more hours. Let's go. That boy isn't far away, the wood dragon spoke up with excitement. He was holding a talisman in his hand. And, this talisman could detect that prince's presence. The two of them had already rushed down to the sea area. They possessed the strength of Sage Realm. So, their speed was extremely quick as they were trod on the rainbow light. They rushed to the deeper region of the sea. The mighty waves were surging under their feet. The demon beasts inside the roaring sea were frequently attacking them. However, Yi Shiwen didn't need to attack. The wood dragon would use his imposing aura and suppress those incautious demon beasts to death. Yi Shiwen remembered that he had also fought with demon beasts in the deeper region of the East Sea in order to train. And, the demons beasts of this sea weren't inferior to those in the East Sea in any aspect. However, it was impossible for these demon beasts to cause any trouble for them. A sage expert was enough to make the sea a dead zone up to the radius of thousands of miles. I can sense he must be nearby, the wood dragon spoke up. The two of them immediately became wary because they knew that people must be chasing that prince in order to kill him. And he was nearby. So, there was a possibility that his enemies could also be around. And these two might have to face a bitter struggle in that case. Yishuan restrained his divine aura. And his body melted into the void. He had managed to conceal his figure in a very efficient manner. 23rd Prince, will you still not surrender? Your subordinates are already dead. Only you are left. Do you still think that you can escape? Someone arrived on the rainbow light as this ice-cold shout was heard from far away. Yishuan looked on with rapt attention. He spotted a young man who seemed approximately 20 years old. He was clad in a magnificent robe. His facial features were quite outstanding. However, he looked in a very distressed state at this time. His magnificent robe had been torn into shreds from several sides. Several huge wounds had also been opened on his body. Some of those wounds had already dried up, while blood was still gushing out from some others. The real elemental energy was shining feebly on his body. In fact, it was flickering. So, it was evident that he was very exhausted. Yishuan immediately realized that this man must be that idiot prince as told by the wood dragon. He was presumably the one they were looking for. The wood dragon had explained that this man had gotten the support of the Northern Dipper organization at first. However, he had then wanted to leave the organization. He genuinely was an idiot. There was nothing wrong if he had wanted to leave the organization. However, he must have looked at his strength first. He had clearly overreached himself. So, he was now paying for his mistake. Several rainbow lights were pursuing him closely. And they were getting increasingly closer to him. Principles seemed to be twining in the auras of the pursuers. All of them turned out to be the experts of the late stage of the semi-sage realm. Moreover, a senior expert having outstanding aura was behind them. He was steadily following everyone from behind. He seemed like a senior expert of the intermediate stage of the sage realm. He had a childish face. And he was clad in splendid clothing. His strength was extremely dreadful. Moreover, he was the one who had spoken those words. I didn't expect that he would be the only one remaining. It seems that his subordinates have already died. Moreover, a sage expert is leading a team to chase and kill him. It's not surprising that he's in such a distressed state. He looks like a dead dog, the wood dragon spoke up after he had swept out his divine sense. He had spoken this in a disdainful tone, but his gaze was firmly fixed on that old man who had a baby face. His subordinates haven't died yet. They've left him so that he can be brought under the control of the Northern Dipper organization. Yishuan took a pause and corrected him. You're right. However, these are top-level matters. We're merely hired goons, and nothing more. So, why do you care about these things? Do you wish to compete with the 7-star officers? He. There's no vacancy among the 7-star officers at this time. But, you may have a chance if you can get rid of any one of them. The wood dragon laughed mischievously and replied. Yishuan didn't pay attention to his sudden leap of thoughts. Was it a joke? Yishuan hadn't seen those 7-star officers. However, he had heard about them from the wood dragon. Each of those 7-star officers was a senior expert at the peak of the Great Sage Realm. And they wouldn't require too much strength to crush him to death. Therefore, Yishuan wasn't thinking about this for now. He and the Northern Dipper organization were merely taking advantage of each other. The Constellation members were only considered as goons who had been hired by the high-level experts. So, he didn't need to pay attention to the secret matters of the Northern Dipper organization. Moreover, he could decide whether he wanted to receive the tasks or not. However, things would change in their entirety once he became a star officer. He would obviously get integrated into the Northern Dipper organization's core. But, he would also have to participate in the Northern Dipper organization's management and future plans. And, he didn't want that. Give up any such idea, the 23rd Prince shouted back in an angered voice. Then, a huge power burst out of his body. He was young. However, he was also a senior expert of the late stage of the semisage realm. So, it wasn't surprising that he had managed to escape under the nose of several senior semisage experts. However, he was struggling to escape from a sage expert. Yi Shiwen secretly nodded. He isn't ready to give up in this adverse situation. In fact, he seems prepared for a major fight. On the contrary. It's not surprising that the Northern Dipper organization had placed their bets on him, and had sent him inside the meteor world as their saboteur. Yi Shiwen knew that this man wasn't the only saboteur of the Northern Dipper organization in the meteor world. However, this scene was enough to prove that this 23rd prince wasn't as incapable as the Wood Dragon had said. "Get ready to attack," the Wood Dragon said. "It won't be easy to deal with this old man. You keep him engaged for a moment. I will return to back you up after I've wiped out those subordinates of the semisage realm." The Wood Dragon wasn't aware of Yi Shiwen's fighting strength. So, he felt that it would best if Yi Shiwen could keep this old man of the intermediate stage of the sage realm engaged for a while. And then, both of them could defeat him together in the end. "Then, don't you blame us for resorting to extreme methods." That baby-faced old man was still smiling. It didn't seem like he was talking about this matter. In fact, it seemed as if was talking about a matter that wasn't terrifying at all. That old man stretched out his big hand to grab the 23rd prince. It wasn't some martial technique. And, it wasn't some magical power either. It was just an average big hand that had swept out. However, it gave off a feeling of calamity as it swept out. Bang! His big hand rose in the sky against the wind. And, it became bigger and bigger as it rose. It then swept down towards the 23rd prince to arrest him. It seemed as if it would grab him to death very shortly after. Attack! Suddenly, a loud shout came out from the void. Then, two figures came out flying from the void. They carried incomparably dreadful auras. It seemed as if mountains and rivers had reversed their directions, while sun and moon had lost their brightness. In fact, it seemed as if these two individuals were the only ones present in the world at this time. "Who are you? Why do you wish to save this trash? Aren't you afraid of offending our great Wei State's fourth prince?" The old man saw these two men clad in moon-white robes. However, he couldn't see their faces. Instead, he only saw the shadows of two individuals who wore monstrous masks. And, this made him fearful and apprehensive to some extent. Chapter 499. What fourth prince of Great Wei State? I haven't heard of him. The Wood Dragon picked his ear and made a contemptuous gesture. The old man's complexion sank when he saw this. He then spoke, "Do the two of you really wish to oppose us?" The old man could see that it wouldn't be easy to deal with Yi Shiwen and the Wood Dragon. And, this had left his heart to palpitate. Otherwise, a man of his temperament would have rushed up to kill them without wasting any time in idle talk. "Great, you've finally arrived." The 23rd prince became relaxed when he saw both of them. He had been dragging this matter in the hope that the people of the Northern Dipper organization would arrive. Things had gotten out of hand. And, he had consequently realized that he was too inexperienced. He used to believe that he possessed enough strength. And thus, he wanted to fly alone. However, he would never have imagined that the Northern Dipper organization would stop caring about him, and would make him land into such a critical situation. The Wood Dragon shot a glance at him. However, he didn't pay much attention to this prince since he believed the man to be an idiot. He was all jolly and frank when he was with Yi Shiwen. But, that was because he believed that Yi Shiwen was qualified enough to be at a par with him. After all, who was Wood Dragon? He was one of the top Heaven's Pride experts of the younger generation. So, he didn't pay any attention to ordinary Heaven's Pride experts. Let alone an unworthy person like the 23rd prince. However, Yi Shiwen nodded after he saw the 23rd prince. Yi Shiwen didn't possess that unfathomable arrogance which the Wood Dragon did. In fact, Yishuan felt that there was no need for such kind of arrogance. The old man was looking at these two individuals in a fearful manner. He hadn't expected that the 23rd prince was still hiding behind a force. Moreover, it was evident that these two individuals weren't the 23rd prince's subordinates. So, they might belong to the force he had joined hands with. This had immediately made him vigilant. They had dared to interfere in the matter of the Great Wei State's royal clan. Moreover, they had conveniently sent two sage experts here. Perhaps, it wasn't an ordinary force. And, the situation might get reversed since the 23rd prince had the support of such a force. It seems that you genuinely wish to oppose us, that old man spoke up in a deep voice. Then, don't blame us for being impolite. He was afraid of these two men. However, he was also quite proud of himself. After all, a sage expert was powerful enough to run amok in a region. Attack, the wood dragon shouted loudly. He suddenly trod forward, and the void got shattered because of that. He then suddenly appeared in front of those semi-sage experts. Bang! A semi-sage expert was caught off guard. And, he got killed by Wood Dragon's quick attack as a result. In fact, the Wood Dragon had broken his skull in one fist attack. He couldn't possibly have survived this. Stop! The old man became scared and angry. He hadn't expected that these two individuals would resort to extreme methods. They simply weren't holding back. He stretched out his fists towards the Wood Dragon. It was an incredible iron fist. He had practiced an extraordinary fist technique. He certainly looked old. However, his pair of fists was extremely powerful. In fact, it was an illustrious fist technique. Wait a moment. Your opponent. Yishuan finally decided to move. A fire-colored big hand stretched out. It seemed as if the fire cloud's falling sky hand could stir the earth and shatter the horizon when displayed by Yishuan. The old man promptly withdrew his attack from the wood dragon, and shot his iron fists towards Yishuan to face his attack. His fists had condensed from his entire Bodhis energy, and looked like mountains as they swept over. Rumble. It was a startling collision. The mountain-like iron fists and sky-falling hands suddenly collided with each other. Terrifying energy waves formed at the spot of collision, and swept across. It seemed as if they'd engulfed the whole world. In fact, it seemed as if the entire space would be torn into shreds. Ah! A loud scream passed through endless light screens. That old man went flying in the sky as blood splashed out from his body. His pair of iron fists had been shattered by Yishuan. He screamed endlessly. The figure that had stood firmly in the void this entire time had been forced to retreat. Poof! The old man spouted blood from his mouth. He was in disbelief as he saw the figure of this man who wore a dragon mask. And, he couldn't believe that he was unable to stop even his one move of his. He had been immersed in practicing this fist technique his entire life. He had progressed and perfected the fist technique to an extremely profound level. In fact, his fists were also known as incomparable iron fists. They could pulverize the entire world. He could even dare to resist a sage tool with his iron fists. However, he didn't expect that his iron fists would get fractured and collapse in front of a single attack from Yishuan. Countless cracks had proliferated from his fingers. In fact, they had reached up to his arms. Blood was gushing out from his arms. This scene looked exceptionally shocking. He had felt as if a terrifying force was crushing his body a moment ago. That big hand had swept down with such a crushing force that it seemed like it could crush the world itself. He would have been done for if it weren't for his iron fists which had withstood most of that overwhelming force. This attack could have split open his body. Moreover, he saw that his opponent had barely moved. It was evident that his opponent's body was extremely tyrannical. In fact, it was beyond anyone's imagination. The old expert had killed and crushed many opponents to reach the sage realm. Most of his opponents had been ordinary talents. And, all of them had died at his hands. However, he had never come across an expert so terrifying that he literally seemed like a god. A gust of wind began to blow. It gave rise to waves of bloody aura. It blew the corner of the hem of Yi Zaiwen's moon-white-colored robe. In fact, it looked as if it was floating in the air. Everyone was stunned when they saw this scene. No matter whether it was those semi-sage experts, or the 23rd prince, or the wood dragon, all of them had been struck dumb in that very instant. A mere palm attack had crushed the offensive of that old man in its entirety. Just how dreadful was his physique? They could swear that they had never seen such a ferocious physique. His opponent was a great expert of the intermediate stage of the sage realm. Moreover, his iron fists were very powerful. However, they had been broken by a mere palm attack of this man's. Those semi-sage experts felt despair as they saw this scene. That sage-level old man was their backbone. These semi-sage experts looked insignificant in this clash between sage-level experts. After all, evil geniuses like Yi Shiwen were very rare to come across. However, this sage-level old man didn't have the power to fight back in front of Yi Shiwen. Moreover, he had collapsed at the first encounter. And, this had pushed them into the abyss of despair. It seemed like they would collapse any moment now. That 23rd prince was also left dumbstruck when he saw this scene. He hadn't expected that he would see such a scene. That old man had been chasing him since a long time. So, he obviously knew that the said old man was very frightening. He had survived till now, but he knew that it wasn't like the old man couldn't kill him. In fact, saying that would be total nonsense. Moreover, he knew that the old man was mere playing hide-and-seek with him, just like a cat plays with a mouse. The old man wanted to tease him before finishing him off. However, the same old man had nearly died by a single slap from Yi Shiwen. So, this man had to be extremely terrifying. And, endless revere had arisen in his heart for the Northern Dipper organization. Only some peripheral members of the Northern Dipper organization had been there to accompany him at first. There were a few sage experts among them. However, there wasn't anyone as terrifying as Yi Shiwen. How ferocious would this organization be if it had even a few such terrifying experts? It would simply be unimaginable. The thought of leaving the Northern Dipper organization and being a lone evil genius had immediately vanished from his mind as a result of this realization. He obviously didn't have any other way either. Well, he at least didn't have such strength at present. However, the one who was stunned the most was none other than Wood Dragon. He also hadn't expected that Yi Shiwen could be so powerful. He was very proud of himself. After all, he was an expert of the intermediate stage of the sage realm even though he was from the younger generation. However, he was still quite afraid of that old man since he must have been cultivating for God knows how many years. So, he had planned that he would deal with that old man along with Yi Shiwen. However, he hadn't expected that Yi Shiwen would single-handedly beat him up like a dog. Crap. This guy is abnormal, the Wood Dragon had no choice but to say this. He finally understood why Qing Su had strongly recommended Yi Shiwen for becoming a member of the Northern Dipper organization. One must know that the Northern Dipper organization was a very loose organization. However, it didn't mean that they wouldn't inspect a person before they'd make them a member of the organization. The Northern Dipper organization had decided to examine Yi Shiwen, and had made him a member after he had been strongly recommended by Qing Su. "Young man, don't be so crazy," that old man roared. Those horrifying cracks on his iron fists had gradually begun to heal. Moreover, his complexion had turned abnormally red. It was evident that he was using some secret technique in order to fix his injuries. He had soon regained the original cold and metallic luster. Then, that old man launched an attack at Yi Shiwen in order to kill him. A pair of fists swept down like small mountains, and it seemed as if they wanted to crush the world. He had instilled his entire life's martial arts power into this pair of iron fists. Consequently, this time's attack had left everyone numb as it swept out. It was far more tyrannical than the previous attack. However, Yi Shiwen didn't even look at him. He obviously didn't want any more trouble. So, he didn't use the fire clouds falling sky hand this time. Instead, he used his current top technique, Big Bang Stardust Fist. Yi Shiwen had gotten very used to the fire clouds falling sky hand. And, this wasn't the case with the Big Bang Stardust Fist yet. In fact, he had even deduced the essence of the fire clouds falling sky hand technique. However, his understanding of the Big Bang Stardust Fist was still higher than that of this technique. He had practiced the Big Bang Stardust Fist for several years. So, it could be said that he had comprehended this fist technique to the pinnacle. Ha! The old man roared. His attack arrived in front of Yi Shiwen within the blink of an eye. Yi Shiwen could almost feel that the wind pressure was tearing apart his facial skin. Bang! Yi Shiwen suddenly shot his fist. And, it pounded on that old man's iron fists like a big star. Crunch, a horrifying sound of breaking of bones reverberated. That pair of iron fists had been broken in the sky once again. Moreover, the condition of the injury was far more dreadful this time. In fact, his entire fists had been badly mangled and mutilated. That old man again spouted a mouthful of blood. His fists had been badly mutilated by Yi Shiwen. He didn't possess an insanely powerful body like Yi Shiwen. Only his fists were extremely powerful. However, they had directly been damaged at this time. He had finally realized that he wasn't a match for this man in the dragon mask. So, he promptly turned around to make his escape. However, how Yi Shiwen could let an enemy escape? He immediately shot his Big Bang Stardust Fist once again. The old man screamed loudly. His body was blasted by the fist's impact. It then broke and he died at once. Chapter 500. The Wood Dragon of the Horn also didn't take too long to wipe out those semi-sage experts once that old man had died. However, his expression had turned rather strange when he saw that he was still one step slower than Yi Shiwen. He remained quiet for a long time before he eventually cussed out, "Fuck. You're abnormal." The 23rd prince also nodded fiercely. Holy fuck. He's really abnormal. That old sage had chased him endlessly, and he hadn't been able to escape from that man. However, that same man had been killed by Yi Shiwen in just one fist attack. So, it would be strange if he weren't to be called abnormal. However, he suddenly realized something and promptly shook his head. He had realized that he couldn't possibly dare to make such a comment out loud, and that too in front of such a ferocious person. The Wood Dragon had dared to joke with Yi Shiwen. However, even the Wood Dragon was nothing in front of Yi Shiwen. So, how he could dare to joke with Yi Shiwen? However, Yi Shiwen didn't care too much about their reactions since he felt that there was nothing to flaunt about killing that old man. There had always been differences in the strengths of the experts of the same level. The matured Heaven's Pride experts had always been far more powerful than ordinary experts. Therefore, it would have been impossible for Yi Shiwen to win so effortlessly if his opponent were to be that Wood Dragon. In fact, it would have only been possible if he had already entered the intermediate stage of the Sage Realm. Thanks a lot to both senior brothers for saving my life. The 23rd prince immediately showed some courtesy towards both individuals once he saw that they had killed the enemies who had been pursuing him. And, the Wood Dragon replied in a cold manner since he believed that they wouldn't have had to go through the trouble of rushing to the meteor world from the true martial world if it weren't for this idiot prince. I sense that people are coming over from everywhere, the Wood Dragon suddenly spoke up. Yi Shiwen had also sensed that there were many divine senses sweeping over from the surroundings. Many figures had appeared far away in the distant sky. This fight had evidently alarmed the nearby forces. We must leave quickly. The 23rd prince became frightened when he heard that more people were coming. He was completely exhausted at this time. And, it should be mentioned that he was scared that he would be chased down endlessly once again. What leave? You mustn't escape at this time. Instead, you must return to the imperial capital and seize the throne. Yi Shiwen faintly replied. He had learned a bit about the ongoing situation on his journey to this place. The current emperor of the Great Wei State had faced a rebound during martial arts practice and lost his sanity. So, his condition had already become hopeless, and it could be said that he was hanging on his last breath. Therefore, the previously mild contest for acquiring the throne had suddenly become intense. And, this was the reason why the 23rd prince was forced to escape. In fact, he had nearly been killed by them in this chase. This had happened because the Northern Dipper organization had withdrawn its support from him, but the 23rd prince himself had the support of a number of other forces. Otherwise, he wouldn't have thought of leaving the Northern Dipper organization. And, this point was enough to leave one to imagine that the competition for the throne of the Great Wei Empire had reached to what extent? Let them see that you aren't afraid anymore, Yi Shiwen said. Let them see that you have again got the support of some people. Show them that you can create your influence. The 23rd prince wasn't the most popular one among the many princes. The most popular ones were the first prince, second prince, fourth prince, seventh prince, and the ninth prince. Moreover, all of them were formidable and ambitious experts of this generation. The situation had turned to this because everybody had started to compete for the throne since the current emperor hadn't crowned the new prince. Therefore, this wasn't the time to remain low-key. Rather, he must make a comeback and advance energetically. He must re-enter the contest for the throne at once. The contest for the throne wasn't so simple. It wasn't that a third party wouldn't try to take the advantage of the fight between two people. Moreover, it was quite possible that some other prince would have defeated all the opponents by now, and may have integrated all the forces under his command while the 23rd prince was still hiding. And, the power of the throne would become rock steady if that were to happen. Consequently, there would be nothing left to fight for. The 23rd prince genuinely deserved the Northern Dipper organization's attention. He had surely panicked for a moment. However, he was quick to realize his mistake. He cupped his hands in obeisance and said, "Then, I will request both of you to help me." However, his vision was fixed on Yi Shiwen as he said this. He had already figured that the Wood Dragon's attitude wasn't very favorable towards him among these two senior experts. However, Yi Shiwen was talking to him nicely. Yi Shiwen had noticed some ambition in him. However, he also believed that the 23rd prince was a man of big ambitions but little talent. This was so because he wouldn't have rashly separated himself from the Northern Dipper organization in the prevalent unclear circumstances if he were genuinely ambitious and shrewd. Sigh, there's long way to go when it comes to helping this guy get on the throne. However, this was also the next part of the task that they had accepted. These two individuals wouldn't have arrived here from so far away if it was only about saving this guy's life. However, Yi Shiwen and the Wood Dragon had already discussed about this while they were on their way. The best method would be to kill everyone else. They must kill whoever would challenge the 23rd prince for the throne, since things would become normal only if they were to kill everyone. Extremely bloody contests had taken place for the throne in the past as well. In fact, people were often slaughtered until only one of them had remained. What are schemes and tricks in front of absolute strength? They are as insignificant as floating clouds. The entirety of those schemes would be shattered if one sword swept down to chop. This was the most straightforward and also the most effective method. The three of them disappeared on the rainbow lights as the spies from many forces looked on. This man is the 23rd prince, right? Someone recognized the 23rd prince and said this. The news that the 23rd prince was being hunted had already spread throughout the Great Wei Empire by this time. However, nobody wanted to save him. This was because there was a lot of confusion in the Great Wei Empire at this time. And, a lot of forces had gotten ready to make trouble. So, nobody knew what would happen in the next second. Moreover, people didn't wish to save a loser prince who looked like he was going to die soon. But, where he has found these two extremely dreadful experts. I know that that old man was an unfathomable expert in the fourth prince's faction. It has been said that the third prince had invited him join his force. In fact, he had even spent huge amount of wealth for that cause. However, he has been defeated by these two men in such an effortless manner. Yeah. And, their dresses lead me to guess that they belong to some force or organization. Perhaps, the 23rd prince has obtained a strong support. the situation will definitely get reversed if that has happened. Well, it's difficult to say that. There is a big chaos inside the imperial capital at present. Each of these princes seems ready to make trouble. And, all of them belong to an ambitious generation. So, none of them is willing to lose. Only God knows who will be ordained by heaven and receive the title of the emperor. Ordained by heaven and receive the title of emperor. He. Who believes in fate nowadays? That is only a means to trick the ignorant masses. Only the person who possesses powerful strength will receive the title of the emperor. All three of them were martial experts. So, their speed was extremely fast. They reached the imperial capital of the Great Wei state in only half a day's time. Who are you people? They had barely arrived above the imperial capital when a senior guard of the legendary's Great Complete Realm came up flying, and shouted. Even a city guard was of the legendary's Great Complete Realm. The Great Wei Empire possessed far more powerful when compared to several big empires of the southern region. Powerhouses of the Sage Realm were rare in the big empires of the southern region. So, the semi-sage experts were the top experts in the main fighting force of those empires. However, this 23rd prince was an expert of semi-sage realm in his own merit. Therefore, it was evident that the disparity between both regions wasn't small. Bastard! Don't you know me? The 23rd prince yelled at him. He had gone through a lot of hardships lately. And, he was running short of time. Moreover, he obviously cared about his prestige the most. 23rd prince. The guard suddenly became stunned as soon as he saw the 23rd prince. He hadn't expected that the 23rd prince would return. Everyone had thought that the 23rd prince was doomed since his forces had been wiped out by the 4th prince. Therefore, this guard hadn't expected that he would see this prince again. No. But, the guard immediately became arrogant after being surprised for a moment. Everyone knows that your majesty disappeared a long time ago. So, you will have to pass through strict checking since you've appeared after such a long time. The complexion of the 23rd prince immediately turned ugly. Did he wish to fight with him on the spot? Would someone need to go through an identification process if they return after an absence of some time period? Wouldn't the entire world become a mess if that were to happen? This clearly showed that someone was deliberately making things difficult for him. Apparently, someone didn't wish for him to come back. Bastard! How dare you? The complexion of the 23rd prince turned gloomy. You're blocking my path. It seems that you don't want to live. Bang! The 23rd prince stretched out his big hand after he had said this. He then grabbed that arrogant guard and crushed him to death. He was transformed into a mass of blood fog as a result. The 23rd prince wasn't a sage expert. However, he was powerful enough to annihilate a legendary's Great Complete Realm expert without breaking a sweat. Yi Shiwen had explained this earlier to him. Either don't return, or show high-handed strength when you return. You will die soon if you remained low-key at this time because those other princes would have thought of all kinds of methods in advance. The people who are weak and don't have the qualifications to compete are the first ones to get cleared out. They would then wait and examine whether they can find a situation in which they can take advantage of the dispute between two parties. He had revealed sufficient high-handed strength this time. The three of them entered the city after they had killed that guard. Those remaining soldiers didn't dare to stop these three individuals since they looked like monsters. Moreover, one of them was the 23rd prince. The emperor had 100 princes and countless grandsons. However, no matter how many princes were there, a prince is a prince. One must not try to bully them. Didn't that pretentious guard get crushed to death a moment ago? Anyway, these were high-level matters. So, why would these soldiers of the city bother to commit a crime and lose their lives in return? The news of the 23rd prince's return had spread throughout the entire imperial capital by now. Some forces who had faster news network had already got the news of 23rd prince's return. And, those better-informed forces had also investigated and found out that two ferocious experts had helped the 23rd prince in killing a senior sage expert of the 4th prince's faction. The rumors about the reversal of situation had begun to spread. Many rumors had proliferated. Some had even said that the 23rd prince had obtained the support of some force, and they had sent experts to support him. There were many other rumors as well. And, all those rumors had spread out at a very quick pace. Chapter 501. The news that the 23rd prince had returned to the imperial capital had spread throughout the entire imperial capital overnight. However, the atmosphere of the imperial capital was already tense. So, this news didn't cause a huge sensation. However, the undercurrent had become even more intense. The three individuals had returned to the 23rd prince's mansion. People of many sects and 23rd prince's faction had arrived in quick succession after they got the news of his return. The 23rd prince was also several hundred years old, and had been operating these forces since then. His forces had been destroyed from the outside. However, he had another huge force hidden in the shadows. However, the strength of the internal forces must be transferred to the external force since the external force had been destroyed. 23rd Prince's faction looked dead a brief while ago. However, it had reorganized in one day. Experts of different ranks had gathered in a group. That group had an expert of the initial stage of the Sage realm and several experts of the Semi-Sage realm. It seemed that the 23rd Prince wasn't that ordinary either. It was such a waste that he had secretly concealed this kind of a force. However, he at least didn't rule out this force, and ultimately decided to use it at this time. Congratulations, Your Majesty has escaped the disaster. Yeah. Congratulations, Your Highness. The fourth prince is so cruel. Many experts congratulated the 23rd prince one after another. But, he didn't smile unnecessarily. Rather, he looked courteous towards the loyalty of the people of his faction. That sage expert among these fighters was a middle-aged man. He had a somewhat gloomy face. He was coldly standing at one place. But, he had an enigmatic air about him. It had been said that this sage expert was known as Old Ancestor Gong Yang. He was a random cultivator with no background. The 23rd prince had requested a sage to come help him with great difficulty. He was also his biggest trump card in this contest for the title of emperor. Not even 1/10 of the total princes could invite a sage realm consecrate. And, only the princes who had invited a sage realm consecrate were eligible to compete for the title of emperor. The 23rd prince had another consecrate expert in his faction apart from the experts of the Northern Dipper organization. However, he had died in the sudden attack that was made by the fourth prince. Such a high-handed 23rd prince had been forced to run away and leave this place in the past. However, that was because several of the most promising princes had joined hands against him. Yi Shiwen and Wood Dragon were standing in a corner. They didn't wish to go out and grab the limelight in front of these people. Your Majesty, you shouldn't be so impulsive. You should have returned quietly. You mustn't have made such a big noise when you returned. We may have attracted the attention of several forces because of this. And, we may consequently become an eyesore for several of princes. The enigmatic-looking old ancestor Gong Yang gave a serious lesson in a chiding manner. He. Yi Shiwen laughed out loud and spoke up, what's the use of remaining hidden? Aren't the other forces' spies present everywhere in this city? So, what's the use of returning quietly? You must show the strength of your stance if you wish to conquer people's heart. What do you think this is? This is a contest for the throne. Yi Shiwen had finally spoken up at this time. He wanted the 23rd prince to assume a strong stance. What was the 23rd prince in the past? He was far from being the most popular one among the princes. In fact, he appeared like a trash when set off. How could such trash have the charisma to gain support of the powerful individuals? This was the necessary requirement to climb up to the throne. Having enough power and support was the real requirement to be the emperor. Only showing one's robust and high-profile attitude was the way to attract the forces that were waiting and watching to become supporters. To increase the strength of one's own force was the general trend. The so-called general trend was making one's own force stronger and stronger. This was the demand of present time, and not like before when the old emperors used to strongly control the empire. Meanwhile, a prince would remain low-key, and would wait for the contention among princes to be over. Then, he'd integrate the entire empire's forces. But, would people wish such a person to obtain the position of the emperor? Obtaining an advantage from the disputes of two parties was a very good idea. However, it wasn't like only they could think of obtaining such advantage. Couldn't other powerful princes think of that as well? The 23rd prince had been chased down once before. That was an attempt to clear him out. This was the best proof. Do you wish to put His Highness in trouble? His Highness is under the influence of your witchcraft. And, that's why he lost self-control and acted like this. The old ancestor Gong Yang pointed a finger at Yi Shiwen. He could sense that the 23rd prince thought very highly of Yi Shiwen and the wood dragon. And, this had left him to feel somewhat threatened. In fact, he felt a threat to his position. One must know that the 23rd prince had only 2 sage realm experts by his side in the past. However, they still wanted to get rid of each other. So, he believed that it was his time to acquire the top position since the other sage expert had died. However, 2 mysterious experts had arrived at this time. And, this could possibly destabilize his position. So, he was quite hostile towards them even though they hadn't spoken anything. Trouble? How can there be no danger if you wish to acquire the position of the emperor? Yi Shiwen coldly laughed and said, which place is completely safe in this world? A stone may fall on you even if you are walking on the road. One mustn't bother about small things in a big matter. One must advance courageously with hope. What if the spies of other princes' factions sent experts to kill His Highness? Can you take this responsibility? Old ancestor Gong Yang became angry. He berated Yi Shiwen as he assumed a loyal and caring expression on his face. I will kill all of them if that happens. Yi Shiwen replied in a casual manner, and, I will keep killing them until nobody dares to take the position of the emperor. The prince's mansion had suddenly turned quiet. In fact, there was a pin-drop silence. And, cold breeze had begun to blow. Everyone was left dumbstruck since they hadn't expected that Yi Shiwen would say such a thing. Nobody could believe their ears. They thought that Yi Shiwen was insane. Did he even know how many sage experts were behind these powerful princes? Even a weak prince like the 23rd prince had the support of 2 sage experts behind him even though he could only be considered as a trash in this contest for the imperial throne. Nobody could imagine how many sage experts were behind those powerful princes. However, Yi Shiwen had dared to claim that he would kill all of them. I will keep killing them until nobody dares to take the position of the emperor. Such words had left everyone to believe that he was insane. Even the wood dragon was looking at him in a shock since he hadn't expected that Yi Shiwen would actually say such a thing. This statement might make other people think that Yi Shiwen was crazy, but wood dragon didn't think so. The entire world might call Yi Shiwen insane, but he wouldn't. And, that was because he could sense the burning confidence in his words. This wasn't arrogance. This was self-confidence. It seemed as if every enemy was insignificant in front of him. He could kill all of them. He would keep killing them until nobody in this world dared to take the position of the emperor. The wood dragon didn't fall behind in praising him. Many of those semi-sage experts were watching this dispute between both sides. Old ancestor Gong Yang clearly had a very big status in the hearts of these people. However, it seemed as if Yi Shiwen wasn't a person to be trifled with either. They had heard that he had saved His Highness. Therefore, 2 powerful individuals were colliding with each other at this time. So, these people would certainly get to watch a good show. However, everyone had taken the old ancestor Gong Yang's side. They didn't have good relations with him on ordinary days. However, he was still one of them. However, these 2 individuals of unknown origins had put on strange masks. Their dresses made it seem as if they belonged to some force. However, they were still outsiders at the end of the day. They wouldn't be afraid if there were only one person to deal with, just like the old ancestor Gong Yang. How ferocious was he alone? However, They were very fearful since Yi Shiwen had the support of an entire force. One must have incredible strength if one had to face a lot of people at once. Everyone criticized Yi Shiwen. Some people called him egoistic, while others called him arrogant and so on. In short, nobody spoke any words of praise for him. He's egoistic. Your Highness, this man is a lunatic. Maybe he's a spy of some other force's faction who wants to put your Highness in trouble. Old Ancestor Gong Yang looked at Yi Shiwen in a bitter manner and said. A loyal and caring expression appeared on his face. He believed that one must maintain a low profile and a fair amount of strength in order to compete for the title of the emperor. They mustn't be extravagant. He couldn't fathom that a person who endured patiently could never become a good ruler of a country. However, Yi Ziwen's opinion was completely different. The so-called maintaining a low profile and being sophisticated were the excuses of the people who didn't have enough strength. One must kill those who try to block one's path if one possesses enough strength. Whoever jumps in the way, must be killed. And then, one shall see who dares to jump in. Yi Shiwen had been following the overbearing method from the beginning when he had chosen the blade skill. And, he had been like that since then. He would go all out. He didn't know any other method. Therefore, he was very familiar with using power to overwhelm people. Nothing was impossible as long as one possessed enough strength. Do you think that you can compete for the imperial throne by relying on such people? Yi Shiwen looked at the 23rd prince. He sneered and said, they are just a bunch of goons. The 23rd prince looked at both sides with a bit of embarrassment. Wouldn't he have known that it was impossible to compete with the entire world by depending on old ancestor Gong Yang and these people? That sudden attack from the 4th prince had defeated his forces in a flash. And, that had been a huge setback for him. He had been operating his force since a long time. However, it had collapsed at the first blow. It didn't matter how much he had been jumping around up till now. He could only be a trash for other people. His only hope was to depend on the support of the Northern Dipper organization. He didn't have a clear idea regarding this mysterious organization. However, this organization had revealed only the tip of the iceberg, and even that was enough to make him tremble with fear. He might perhaps fight with the Northern Dipper organization after he had taken the authority of the empire in his hands. However, he wasn't thinking about this at present. Old ancestor Gong Yang and other people weren't inferior. However, such strength wouldn't have any major effect on those powerful princes. You. Old ancestor Gong Yang glared at Yi Shiwen. He opened his eyes wide. In fact, it seemed as if he wanted to break open. After all, he was a senior sage expert in his own merit. However, Yi Shiwen had evaluated them as goons. And, he was obviously included among them. Goon. Nobody had ever called him that. One doesn't get extremely angry by verbal humiliation. However, this happens when someone disregards them in their entirety. Chapter 502. The 23rd prince had become exceptionally embarrassed. He agreed with what Yi Shiwen had said. One could say that these people were merely a bunch of hoodlums in comparison. However, he couldn't address them like that because he would hurt his subordinates if he did. Brat, you have made me furious. Old ancestor Gong Yang became angry. An iron sword appeared in his hand. It suddenly issued astonishing sword energy towards Yi Shiwen along with a clang sound. The sword energy broke down the space, and arrived in front of Yi Shiwen within the blink of an eye. Humph! Yi Shiwen coldly snorted, and his golden hand suddenly stretched out. It transformed into a very big hand above the prince's mansion, and suddenly pressed down. Yi Shiwen had perfected the fire clouds falling sky hand to such an extent that no one could refute him if he were to say that he belonged the fire cloud cave. Of course, he would need to change his clothes and appearance first. Even the wood dragon of the horn was left dumbstruck by this. This style of the fire clouds falling sky hand looked more authentic than the traditional one. Perhaps, he would have also believed that Yi Shiwen belonged to the Fire Cloud Cave if he didn't know that he was a disciple of the true martial university. However, he still had no other choice but to doubt Yishuan. Could Yishuan be an undercover spy of the Fire Cloud Cave in the true Martial University? I can't fucking believe my eyes. This is seriously against the heaven's will. There's a saying in layman's language, one shouldn't bite off more than one can chew. However, Yishuan didn't need to worry about that. He had the mysterious space at his disposal. He could easily chew and digest any type of technique as long as he had enough spirit energy. So, there simply wasn't a situation in which he could bite off more than he could chew. The iron sword struck Yi Zaiwen's big hand. However, it couldn't even put a scratch on it. On the contrary, a metal clanging sound resounded as it struck his big hand. But, his big hand continued to press down invariably. The old ancestor Gong Yang felt an enormous force pressing down upon him. The portion between his thumb and forefinger got ruptured, and blood splashed out. The old ancestor Gong Yang became indescribably terrified. He hadn't thought that Yi Zaiwen's body could be so powerful. The body of a person who had practiced a body tempering technique was likely to be very powerful, especially of a person who had practiced a martial technique for tempering one's body. However, it still couldn't be one's strongest point because people might attain intrepid bodies, but there were very rare top-notch physiques that could surpass the toughness of divine weapons and the divine tools. These weapons could break the formidable body of any person. So, it was useless to rely on the toughness of one's body to face those divine tools. But, an extremely powerful body like that of Yishuan was also very rare. Many experts used to wear gloves made up of golden cicada's silk for using the divine tools. How could the old ancestor Gong Yang have accepted his defeat? He used his strongest sword technique, wind and thunder sword technique. Wind and thunder erupted all of a sudden. And, countless sounds of thunder reverberated. Then, endless thunder and lightning suddenly pounded on top of Yi Zaiwen's big hand. However, it seemed as if those thunder and lightning had pounded on a stone. They couldn't budge his big hand. In fact, they could only set off a puff of black smoke. Bang! Yishuan crushed the old ancestor Gong Yang's sword energy. Puff! Old ancestor Gong Yang spouted a mouthful of blood, and his body went flying upside down. Yishuan retracted his hand. He didn't say anything. The spectators were left dumbstruck at this sight. The complexions of the people who had been accusing Yishuan had turned pale. It seemed as if they had unknowingly eaten a bunch of live cockroaches. Yishuan hadn't argued with them. He had only made them dizzy with a tight slap on their faces. And, this was the best response to the situation. Many people had suddenly become scared since this man's way of doing things was extremely ruthless. After all, the old ancestor Gong Yang held the top position among them. One must know that the 23rd Prince's subordinates were divided into two factions in the past. And, each group was headed by a sage expert. Both the groups used to be at clash with each other. However, that other sage expert had been annihilated along with his faction. So, only the people who favored the old ancestor Gong Yang remained. Moreover, they clearly knew how terrifying he was since they were his subordinates. The reason why these people had participated in this contest for the throne was because they hoped that they could also obtain Great Way State's resources for their cultivation if the 23rd Prince got a hold of the great treasure of the state. They didn't belong to the meteor sect. The life of a random cultivator with no background was quite miserable in the meteor world. In fact, it was even more miserable than that in the true martial world. After all, there were many forces in the true martial world. But, there was only one big force in the meteor world, and that was the meteor sect itself. Their complexions had suddenly turned pale since they were afraid that Yishuan might launch an attack on them. These people can't even beat me. How they will help you in competing for the throne? Yishuan looked at 23rd Prince and said. He didn't even bother to pay attention to these people. However, the 23rd Prince had a glorious smile on his face at this time. He had already seen how powerful Yishuan was. And, he had gotten to see it once again at this juncture. However, his reaction to this incident was different from the previous one. He had been left to tremble with fear the last time. However, he wasn't even shocked this time around. Elder brother is outstanding and matchless, the 23rd prince spoke up. You people must listen and obey these two elder brothers. You must follow them blindly. Am I clear? The 23rd prince was very ambitious and bold. So, he had immediately changed his point of view. Moreover, he was quite the hoodlum himself. Anyway, people who walk barefooted aren't afraid of wearing shoes. Everything would go in vain if he couldn't ascend to the throne. The old ancestor Gong Yang crawled and stood up. He merely looked at Yi Shiwen with hatred. However, he didn't dare to contradict the 23rd prince. I don't care about these mundane affairs. Some people will come to you. You must listen to whatever they say, and obey. Yi Shiwen waved his hand and spoke up. The constellation members like Yi Shiwen, these so-called high-level hired goons, didn't care about these ordinary matters. Their task was to kill, and they needed outstanding strength for that. Do you know about the situations of other princes? Yi Shiwen asked. He obviously wanted to know as much about his future opponents as was possible. My eldest imperial brother is the most powerful among all these princes because he was born very long ago. He has already roped in a large number of courtiers. Plus, he also has the reputation of the eldest son. It has been said that he has the support of a peak-level sage expert behind him, the 23rd prince replied. Moreover, my second imperial brother, fourth imperial brother, seventh imperial brother, ninth imperial brother, and so on, are also quite powerful. It is said that all of them have the support of a peak-level sage expert behind them. Yi Shiwen frowned. The enemy had the backing of peak-level experts of the sage realm. So, it wasn't surprising that the 23rd prince could only play the role of trash. A peak-level expert of the sage realm couldn't be called the strongest in the sage realm. However, he could be considered as a top-notch expert in the competition for the throne of a country. Peak-level expert of the sage realm. Yi Shiwen frowned. My fighting strength can ascend to the peak of the sage realm only after I've entered into the sage realm. Only then will I be able to contend against them. He became anxious as he thought of this, since he himself might become useless in this contest for the title of the emperor if he didn't snatch the time and refine the sage break yellow pill. In fact, even his life might be put in danger. Prepare a place for me. I wish to undergo closed-door training. Yi Shiwen looked at the 23rd prince and spoke up. The wood dragon of the horn immediately realized what Yi Shiwen was talking about, since he was aware about Yi Ziwen's intentions to start the alchemy process. In fact, he was also very interested in the medicinal pill which Yi Shiwen wanted to refine. Okay. The 23rd prince nodded. A person of his stature obviously had a place for the closed-door training inside his mansion. Yi Shiwen didn't show any courtesy. His task was only to help the 23rd prince in eliminating some of the obstacles, nothing more. These two individuals were only the first wave of assistance. The Northern Dipper organization would send more members here later on. In fact, some of those unofficial personnel were the subordinates of the 23rd prince in the beginning. There were many powerful sage experts among those people. Even though they were merely unofficial members of the organization, but they possessed extremely dreadful strength. Yi Ziwen's strength wasn't too weak. However, this organization was extremely dreadful. The more he came to know about this organization, the more dreadful he felt they were. He had come to know about some basic situations of this organization from the Wood Dragon while en route to the Meteor World. And, he couldn't help but gasp. Yi Shiwen had previously thought that this was merely an organization which used to recruit the experts of the younger generation. However, he later came to know that this was not the case. And, that was because he and the other young members had only been recruited as substitutes in recent time. The titles of Moon Deer of the Extended Net, the Wood Dragon of the Horn, and the Golden Dragon of the Neck had been vacant for very long time. And, they had only been filled by these youngsters in recent times. Two other experts of the younger generation had also joined very recently. However, it seemed as if they and Wood Dragon didn't share good relations. There seemed to be only 5 known members of the younger generation. The others were the experts of the older generation. In fact, the latest among them had become the member of this organization 300 years ago. Moreover, all of them had entered the Great Sage realm long ago. Even those peripheral members had some Great Sage experts among them. Such was the tyranny of the Northern Dipper organization. The more he came to know about them, the more dreadful he felt this organization was. The Northern Dipper organization wouldn't leave the 23rd prince since they had already decided to help him in acquiring the throne. So, his attitude would make no difference to them. Therefore, they would obviously send some experts to assist him. And, Yi Shiwen and Wood Dragon would be merely playing the leading roles. These people would obviously have their own set of processes to follow. And, Yi Shiwen wasn't aware of these processes. But, what role they would play if they wouldn't even arrive here? You inform the organization to get those people to gather here after some time. It will look somewhat miserable if only 2 of us are here. Yi Shiwen looked at the Wood Dragon and said with a laugh. The other princes had a group of high-handed experts behind them. However, the 23rd prince only had 2 experts behind him. How ridiculous it would look. The so-called grand style was also very important sometimes. No problem. Leave it to me. The Wood Dragon nodded. His expression wasn't visible since he had worn a mask. Yi Shiwen followed the 23rd prince, and entered an underground place which had been built for undergoing the closed-door training. He then sat cross-legged on a praying mat on the ground after he had lain down layer upon layer of matrix barriers. Then, he took out a huge ancient alchemy furnace from the heavenly source mirror. The faintly fluctuating principles were looming on top of this furnace. This furnace was a pseudo-sage tool in reality. He had obtained this furnace from the crazy 13 shark pirates. However, it had later been upgraded into as a pseudo-sage tool by him. However, one must have an alchemy furnace of sage tool rank in order to refine the sage break yellow pill. But, he was forced to use this pseudo-sage tool instead. Chapter 503. Yi Shiwen couldn't do anything about this matter either. How he could get hold of a sage tool that easily? Powerful sage experts who were using pseudo-sage tools could be found everywhere. He had obtained the Blood Emperor seal of that blood-red-clothed young master last time. However, it had been snatched and swallowed by Yi Shiwen estimated that this alchemy furnace could refine the break sage yellow pill only once at the most. Therefore, he had only one opportunity. Moreover, he didn't know when he would be able to collect so many ingredients in the future if he failed this time. The alchemy fire was promptly ignited on top of Yi Shiwen's hand. It looked extremely deep in color. Such kind of alchemy fire was unique to an alchemy mazer. He wasn't an alchemy master. However, he knew a core method of alchemy. Moreover, he knew a top-notch core method. However, he didn't wish to walk on this path of alchemy. Otherwise, he would have to spend the rest of his life in deep mountains and old forests looking for the herbal ingredients. Water moon robust tin fur. Moon silk immortal fruit. Yi Shiwen threw the unfamiliar and familiar drug ingredients inside the alchemy furnace. He was carefully controlling the flame. He had divided the drug ingredients in the order of priority, and had thrown them into the furnace one after another. This was the first time Yi Shiwen was performing the alchemy so carefully. One must know that he used to refine those drug ingredients in the past with the help of the extraordinary abilities of his mysterious space. So, he had never faced any trouble. However, he had to be careful this time. And, that was because he knew that this would decide whether he could enter the sage realm or not. Yi Shiwen looked focused. His gaze was firmly fixed on the alchemy furnace. The inexhaustible alchemy fire was surging, and was being reflected on his pitch-black eyes. He was carefully controlling the temperature of the flame, and matching the available resources with the information in his mind. He couldn't afford to commit a single mistake. Time passed second by second. And, 3 days' time had passed in the blink of an eye. The peripheral members of the Northern Dipper organization who were initially waiting for the organization's latest orders had arrived in the imperial capital during these 3 days. A delegation of 10 men had arrived in total. And, all of them were experts of the Sage Realm. One among them was a senior expert of the late stage of Sage Realm, while 2 of them were experts of the intermediate stage of the Sage Realm. Old Ancestor Gong Yang and other people had suddenly become enlightened after they got to witness such a lineup. They obviously couldn't provoke this organization which was before their eyes. It had conveniently sent 10 strong sage experts. Such high-handed style meant that these experts certainly had the support of some dreadful force. In fact, Old Ancestor and the others felt unusually scared at the mere thought of it. The face of 23rd Prince looked very calm. However, he was also extremely terrified in his heart. The Northern Dipper organization hadn't sent such a team when they were supporting him earlier. But, they had sent 10 sage experts at this time. And, such capability had daunted him straight away. The Wood Dragon of the Horn couldn't do anything in this matter after the arrival of these sage experts. These experts were more professional as compared to the so-called professional hired goons like him and Yi Shiwen. These experts would obviously be the ones planning everything in the 23rd Prince's matter in a clear and orderly fashion. In fact, it would be pointless for the 23rd Prince to think that he could protest against such a powerful organization. The Wood Dragon was sitting on a branch of a big tree inside the prince's mansion. He was leaning against the trunk of the tree at this time. He drank mouthful of liquor from the waste bottle gourd. It wasn't a very old liquor. However, it was white liquor. And, a strong one at that. 3 days have already passed. He isn't done yet. The Wood Dragon looked below. It was a flat surface, and it seemed as if there was nothing down there. However, he knew that there was a place inside where Yi Shiwen was undergoing the closed-door training. I will also find a place and undergo closed-door training once this matter gets finished. And, I will enter the late stage of the Sage Realm this time. The Wood Dragon suddenly smelled herbal fragrance at this time. It was permeating from underground. Then, a burst of magnificent fragrance permeated from the barrier which had been laid down underground, and soared into the sky. Crap. It's so fucking intense. Which pill is he refining? The Wood Dragon exclaimed in shock. He could confirm the grade of the medicinal pill that was being concocted by merely looking this barrier. The medicinal pills were also divided into many ranks. The unranked pills weren't popular in the least, and were simply not worth mentioning since the unranked ones were merely ordinary pills. However, things would be a lot different if the talk was about ranked pills. In fact, every such pill would be enough to draw the attention of countless experts. The pills would be divided into 3 ranks by the people of the entire world after their worth had been confirmed. And, every rank was divided into 9 grades. So, there were 27 grades in total. The so-called divine pill was at the top. However, it was only mentioned in fables. Nobody had ever seen it. It had been said that the divine pill could attain spiritual intelligence right since its formation. Then, it would have to face the heavens' punishment. And, it could even transform into an expert and cultivate in case it would pass this punishment. Moreover, it could create a chaotic mess, just like a demon. However, the Wood Dragon reacted since such a big noise might attract the attention of countless people in the imperial capital. People had been keeping watch at the 23rd Prince's residence. In fact, dozens of spies of each big force had been keeping watch. However, it was hard to say how things would turn out to be. It seemed as if all the big forces had collectively become invisible after the flashy return of the 23rd Prince. Nobody had come to visit him apart from Old Ancestor Gong Yang and the old members of his faction. It seemed as if everyone had forgotten him. Only those spies were still around and keeping watch. However, this movement might draw the attention and backlash of countless people of the imperial capital since it was secretly in an uproar. Sure enough, it didn't take long for the several tyrannical auras, which Wood Dragon had sensed in the surroundings not too long ago, to arrive in the sky above 23rd Prince's domain. Presumptuous. Who permitted you to rush into the prince's mansion? The 23rd Prince's loud shout reverberated. It then transformed into a barrage of sound arrows, and spread out in the sky. people's figures revealed themselves in midair. Several warriors clad in heavy armors were in the front. And they were headed by a man who was clad in silver-white heavy armor. "Go back, Your Majesty. I am the Nine Gates Infantry Commander. We have heard that the enemy's spies are present here. So, your humble servant had no choice but to arrive here to investigate in order to ensure your safety," the man who was clad in silver-white armor spoke up in friendly manner. He had also swept out his divine sense to search as he had spoken this. The 23rd Prince's face turned green in anger. The spies of enemy countries had arrived here. Didn't this statement mean that he had collaborated with foreign enemies? This was a blatant slap on his face. Moreover, he knew that this Nine Gates infantry commander had been hired by his fourth brother in secrecy. So, they had arrived here in order to search his mansion. In fact, they must have arrived here in order to eradicate the root of trouble. "Initiate the search," the chief in silver-white armor ordered in a loud voice. And several experts immediately appeared behind him. They seemed all set to rush in. "I am warning you people. Whoever dares to come in shall be killed," the 23rd Prince suddenly shouted back at them. He mostly cared about his reputation. However, his reputation had been ruined now, and nothing had remained. He could tell that every major force must be paying attention to this ongoing situation here. So, he would have no hope of reprieve if he were to take even a single step back. He finally understood that Yishuan had said rightly. Being low-key was useless since being quiet at present would be considered as weakness by the people. The small and big forces of the city wouldn't care about him even if he managed to evade this trouble. So, how would he conquer the hearts of the people? Initiate the search. The silver-armored chief wasn't willing to back down either. He shouted loudly, and the figures of several experts clad in heavy armors appeared behind him in quick succession. Someone recognized them. There were the Imperial Guards. They were the most elite army in the Great Wei Empire. "It's such a drag," a conspicuous and indolent voice resounded at first. Then, an astonishing blade energy took form, and swept out towards that group of Imperial Guards to chop them. "Humph! So audacious! You are a crafty fella." The silver-armored chief coldly snorted. He grabbed the approaching blade energy with his one hand, and crushed it. Then, a sinister look appeared on his face. "Kill him. This is like they have shed all pretense of cordiality. It seems that the fourth prince has made up his mind to use extreme methods against the 23rd prince. What's strange in that? The 23rd prince had escaped from the fourth prince. And he had lost his face as a result. In fact, it would be strange if he were to bear with such rudeness. They didn't clash in the past several days. So, I thought that there will be no fight. I didn't expect that the Nine Gates infantry commander would be sent over here." The Nine Gates infantry commander was quiet in the past. He hadn't taken part in the battles of the princes. In fact, he looked neutral. Therefore, I didn't expect that he had secretly sided with the fourth prince. The secrecy maintained was indeed very tight. He. Didn't you see those rays of light a moment ago? It may be a ranked medicinal pill. It is being refined in the mansion of the 23rd prince. This is probably the reason for this sudden attack by the fourth prince. I didn't expect that the 23rd prince would come back alive. The situation has completely reversed as a result. Several sage-level auras can be sensed inside his mansion. He may have obtained the support of some organization. Bang! The wood dragon and the silver-armored chief suddenly collided with each other. The two senior experts of the intermediate stage of the Sage Realm issued their imposing auras. And the astral winds suddenly splashed out in the sky. The formidable imposing aura that had emerged out of the body of the wood dragon pressed down in all directions. And the tyrannical strength of the intermediate stage of the Sage Realm manifested thereupon. The space got crushed and distorted by his imposing aura. And it seemed as if every movement of his could destroy the heaven and extinguish the earth. The two senior experts of the intermediate stage of the Sage Realm had suddenly collided with each other. However, those imperial guards had burst into the prince's mansion. In fact, they had simply ignored the fight between these two individuals. It was obvious that the 23rd prince was their target. They wanted to take advantage of this chaos and kill him in one fell swoop. Humph! An ice-cold shout sounded. And a big hand stretched out along with it. It then grabbed those imperial guards. There were many experts of the initial stage of the Sage Realm among those imperial guards. However, they had been grabbed by this big hand, and didn't get enough time to react as a result. Then, the big hand crushed them to death. And they transformed into blood fog as a result. A loud shout was heard, and an old man clad in moon-white robes slowly came out. He then stationed himself beside the 23rd prince. He was an expert of the late stage of the Sage Realm, and hailed from the Northern Dipper organization's faction. Those imperial guards were also skilled experts, but how could they be a match for this senior expert of the late stage of the Sage Realm? Rumble. The wood dragon and that commander of the imperial guards went high up into the sky while fighting. The matrix barrier above the entire imperial capital had been broken by them. They then rushed above the horizon. And they soon went beyond everyone's line of sight. 23rd brother, it seems that you're not ready to give up. You even dared to kill the imperial guards. You're quite courageous. An ice-cold shout resounded from the clouds at this time. A figure appeared in mid-air along with the sound. He was clad in the imperial robe of a prince. He looked handsome, and his appearance was a bit similar to the 23rd prince's. However, his deathly white complexion was giving rise to a sinister illusion. Chapter 504. Fourth brother, the 23rd prince shouted. He called out the identity of this man who was before his eyes. It was one of the most powerful princes of the imperial capital, the fourth prince. The fourth prince shot a glance at the 23rd prince as he appeared from inside the clouds. He then said, 23rd young brother, I'm also feeling quite embarrassed like you. Do you know what will be the result of attacking the imperial guards? Even imperial father can't save you. I will have to kill you in order to protect the dignity of the law of my Great Way Empire. A smile appeared on the face of the fourth prince when he said that he would have to kill the 23rd prince. Perhaps, he wanted to show how just he was. However, he had instead made people aware of his shady motives. Fourth brother, don't go too far. A trace of fear flashed in the eyes of the 23rd prince. He didn't have a good opinion regarding his fourth brother. Everyone knew that imperial guards were being used as a pretext, nothing more. One must know that the imperial guards were very powerful. Nobody had ever dared to attack them. However, that power had originated from the dignity of imperial authority. Nobody dared to contend against them because they were the emperor's guards. However, the emperor himself was helpless at present. The shining corona of the imperial power was nowhere to be seen. So, the imperial guards didn't have the ferociously deterrent power like they used to. The black-clothed old man who stood beside the 23rd prince suddenly launched an attack at this time. And a heavenly big hand stretched out towards the fourth prince to grab him. It seemed as if this big hand had merged the heaven and the earth within itself. And it clenched with the capacity to crush the world. However, an astonishing sword energy broke out before that big hand could grab the fourth prince. Then, this sword energy transformed into a startling sword rainbow, and slashed into that big hand. Rumble. The entire big hand had been chopped down in an instant. Then, the incredible sword rainbow suddenly struck that black-clothed old man's body after it had passed through that big hand made up of energy. The black-clothed old man became very startled. He promptly withdrew his hand. Nearly his entire arm had been cut down by that astonishing sword rainbow. A huge and terrible wound had been opened on his arm by the sword energy even though he had withdrawn it. And blood was gushing out from it. The black-clothed old man let out a muffled snort. He then looked up to the sky. A small-sized expert came out of the void. His height was less than 1 meter. He was holding a long sword in his hand. It looked even taller than him. In fact, he looked a bit funny. However, nobody could laugh in this situation because everyone had seen that this man's sword had nearly cut off the arm of that black-clothed old man of the 23rd Prince's faction. I've heard rumors that the 4th Prince has a peak-level sage expert at his side to keep watch. And, it seems that it's true, someone from among the spectators of the big forces gasped and said. Sage experts were rarely seen even in a huge empire like the Great Wei Empire. One could ensure their position in the Great Wei Empire as long as they had a senior sage expert in their clan to keep watch. And, one could start a noisy development as long as they had 2 experts of sage rank or above. Sage experts of peak level were obviously the topmost experts that were recruited by these forces. However, the experts of the small perfection level and great perfection level of Sage Realm were merely a myth for them. So, one could imagine that the experts of Great Sage Realm were like gods for them. I know that expert. He's called Dwarf Tiger. He's a ferocious expert. However, his short height is his weak point. He hates it when other people talk about his height. The city lord of a certain city had made fun of his weakness some time ago. So, this guy had slaughtered everyone in the entire city. In fact, he hadn't spared anyone. He had run into some extremely ferocious enemies later. So, he had disappeared without any trace after he had sustained some serious injuries. Therefore, I had believed that he had died. However, I never expected that he had obtained the support of the 4th Prince instead. The 23rd Prince is done for. Such an expert is definitely going to cause huge trouble. Bang! A firm and imposing aura soared into the sky from the backyard of the 23rd Prince's mansion. And, herbal fragrance began to proliferate in the surroundings. Everyone was trembling with fear, including those experts of each of the forces of the Wei state even though they were only watching the fight. Everyone knew that the 4th Prince and the 23rd Prince had a very old enmity between them. The 23rd Prince had been chased by the 4th Prince once before, and he had almost lost his life when that had happened. However, the 4th Prince had waited very patiently for these 3 days. And, he had suddenly launched an attack today. This incident and the sudden rise of the fragrance of those precious medicines might have some relation. Perhaps, some ranked medicinal pill might have taken birth. One must know that a person could become the so-called extraordinary sage and transcend the mortal world after they had cultivated up to the sage realm. They would become different from the ordinary people from this stage onwards. So, an ordinary medicinal pill would be of no use for them since it couldn't be used on their sage body. Only the ranked medicinal pills refined by some talented alchemy master would be useful for them. Therefore, the so-called great masters of alchemy were considered to be a treasure for any empire. 4th Prince must have come to know that a great alchemy master had joined the 23rd Prince's side. And, this must have compelled him to launch this sudden attack. However, they probably didn't know that Yi Xuan wasn't some great alchemy master. In fact, one must perfect hundreds of kinds of pill-making methods if they wanted to achieve the title of a great master of alchemy. Most people couldn't concoct ranked medicinal pills. And thus, they were only called alchemy masters. Yi Xuan knew many pill-making methods. However, he could only refine a few medicinal pills. And, the only ranked medicinal pill that he knew how to refine was the Break Sage Yellow Pill. Moreover, he had learnt this method only recently. So, he was no great alchemy master. Everyone was merely overestimating his capabilities. This had been possible only because of his mysterious space. He couldn't have been able to do this if he didn't possess this special space. It's similar to when a child studies all the subjects like literature, native language, English, mathematics, and so on for a year in order to ascend from first grade to junior high. However, Yi Xuan had put more emphasis on some selected subject alone. In fact, he had also skipped grades, and had directly begun to study the mathematics of junior high level. Thus, he hadn't studied the mathematics of elementary school level. Moreover, he hadn't studied literature and language either. So, he couldn't even recognize the letters therein. However, Yi Xuan didn't need to understand the problem in order to figure out the correct answers. He only needed to analyze the optimum method to solve the problem with the help of his mysterious space. And he could then figure out the correct answer. This was the role that the mysterious space in his mind had been playing for him. However, other people didn't know this. So, they believed that the 23rd prince had invited a great master of alchemy. Even the 23rd prince himself was no exception to this belief. So, he had also become very excited. A great master of alchemy could be considered as a very important guest, a guest of honor, and so on in an empire. Therefore, the 4th prince had become anxious and had launched an attack. He wanted to get hold of such a great master of alchemy before other forces could act. 23rd young brother, I didn't expect that you would silently invite a great master of alchemy, the 4th prince spoke up in a sinister manner. He was staring at the 23rd prince. It seems that he is refining some stunning item. However, it will fall into my hands now. He genuinely had the urge to burst into laughter since he felt as if the heavens were helping him. He would obtain such a great master of alchemy in this crucial time of contest for the throne. And his force would become extremely popular when a great master of alchemy would join it. In fact, many third-party forces would decide to join his force once they had seen the face of a great master of alchemy. You should give up on that idea, the 23rd prince clenched his teeth and replied. He had suddenly realized that Yi Xuan might help him in making a comeback. It would be a very exciting matter if a great master of alchemy were to join his force at such a turning point when he was all set to reverse the situation. The entire Great Wei state used to have one great master of alchemy in the past. However, he had left 100 years ago. So, one could imagine how few were the numbers of the great masters of alchemy in this world. After all, only those alchemy masters who could refine ranked medicinal pills were called as great masters of alchemy. Yi Xuan brushed away the fragrance and white vapor of medicines which had proliferated in that underground secret room. The entire alchemy furnace had already broken into pieces, and had spread out on the ground. Only a yellow-colored medicinal pill was calmly lying at the bottom of the alchemy furnace. The thick herbal fragrance had filled the entire room. He had done it. Yi Zaiwen's face exposed a pleasantly surprised look. He had put everything on stake for refining the break sage yellow pill in one fell swoop because he had a limited amount of ingredients. One needed to spend more than 50 million primary spirit dawn for obtaining that amount of ingredients. Even a sage expert would be scared to death if they heard this price. In fact, a peak-level sage expert wouldn't be able to obtain such amount of ingredients even if they went bankrupt over it. Yi Xuan wouldn't have had enough wealth to accumulate these ingredients even if the people of Law Enforcement Hall hadn't attacked and interfered. He would have needed time to accumulate that amount of money. However, the Northern Dipper organization had fortunately handed over these drug ingredients to him in advance. Otherwise, he genuinely wouldn't have known what to do. He wouldn't have blinked an eye before spending 50 million primary spirit dawn for buying the drug ingredients. He might have regretted that later. However, he would have been very firm on his decision. And that's because he knew that other people had used their own talent to level up. But that was because they possessed outstanding talent. However, he needed endless amount of accumulated wealth for that because of his cultivation style. In fact, the amount of wealth he had used up in these 10 years of his cultivation was enough for 100 individuals to cultivate up to the sage realm. However, he had access to such wealth-powered cultivation. Therefore, he was still extremely tyrannical in the younger generation even though his cultivation time was quite short. Strength was the most valuable thing. Any heavenly treasure which couldn't be transformed into strength was practically useless. In addition to this, he could only use the alchemy furnace once in order to refine this pill. And it had exploded after that. Therefore, it wasn't surprising that the number of great masters of alchemy was so less. One must learn how to refine ranked medicinal pills if they wanted to become a great master of alchemy. And one must have a sage-level alchemy furnace if they wanted to refine a ranked medicinal pill. However, sage tools were very rare. Let alone a sage-level alchemy furnace. Therefore, many people used to get stuck at this stage. Fortunately, he had succeeded even though he had put everything on stake in one fell swoop. So, his anxious heart had finally calmed down. Yishuan wasn't aware of the desperate situation outside because he had been refining the break sage yellow pill. However, he suddenly felt that a tyrannical sage-level aura had entrenched from above, and was trying to investigate the situation inside. In fact, this sage-level aura wanted to break through the matrix barriers that he had laid out. He immediately became anxious as a result. And, he promptly picked up that break sage yellow pill, and swallowed it. Chapter 505. Bang! Rumble. The 23rd Prince's mansion had been transformed into a battlefield. The strengthened materials that had been used to construct this mansion couldn't withstand the unceasing bombardments of the many semi-sage and legendaries great complete realm experts either. And, they had consequently broken down into small pieces. The neighboring areas had been destroyed and turned into a complete mess. In fact, the entire imperial capital would have been tossed about if everyone hadn't controlled themselves on purpose. Ha, ha. The black-clothed old man who was in the faction of the 23rd Prince was panting unceasingly. Hardly any of his body part was in good condition. It was nearly visible that the sword energy had severed his body vertically and horizontally. An expert like him who was at the late stage of the sage realm didn't have any power to fight back while facing that dwarf tiger. He only differed from that dwarf tiger by one small step. However, he didn't have any power to fight back in front of that dwarf tiger who was at the peak level of the sage realm. In fact, it looked like a game between a cat and mouse, perhaps more along the lines of the way a cat plays with a mouse before it eats it. And, even the 23rd Prince was in a bind. He hadn't faced the attacks of the dwarf tiger yet. However, there were many experts in the 4th Prince's faction. The paths of those sage experts had been blocked by the sage experts of the Northern Dipper organization. However, the semi-sage experts were still approaching to kill him, and he was being forced to retreat again and again. The 4th Prince was watching this show from not very far off. And, it seemed as if he was having a lot of fun as he said, "Kill them for me. Kill all of them. Then, go and take a look which great alchemy master has been invited by my 23rd brother." He didn't dare to neglect the great alchemy master. A great alchemy master might not be a sage expert. However, these great alchemy masters were a group of very ferocious people. And, that's because they could refine countless medicinal pills. So, many people could be benefited from their skill set. And, this very fact was enough to distinguish them from others experts. The great alchemy masters might hide their key importance. And, they usually looked very ordinary. However, they might attract a group of high-handed great sage experts to crush someone if the said entity offended them. A boundless aura suddenly emerged out from the backyard of the prince's mansion at this time. And, it continued to soar up in a gradual manner. Someone must be making a breakthrough. Everyone was left dumbstruck. They hadn't expected that someone would make a breakthrough at such a crucial time. Moreover, it was a sage realm tribulation. Many sage experts were present here. Even the 4th Prince himself was a sage expert. So, they weren't unfamiliar with the sage realm tribulation. Therefore, they sensed it immediately. This breakthrough had appeared from the backyard. So, this could mean that that great alchemy master was the one breaking through. A great alchemy master might not necessarily have to be a sage expert. However, his value would increase several folds if he were to be a great alchemy master of the sage realm. He would become even more precious. And, that's because sage realm was the beginning of transcending the mortal world. A sage expert's lifespan would increase up to 2,000 years. So, the result would be completely different. The 4th Prince had become even more excited at this realization. His strength would increase by leaps and bounds if he could obtain the help of a sage realm powerhouse who was also a great alchemy master. Moreover, it would also be a very big advantage for the Great Wei Empire in the future. However, the 4th Prince wasn't the only one who was thinking about this. The other princes were also thinking about this. Many divine senses of the princes of third-party forces had become restless. And, many people had started to wonder if they could get hold of that great alchemy master before the 4th Prince. No one believed that the 23rd prince would be able to make a comeback from this. In fact, he had already died in the eyes of those people after the grand-scale attack of the 4th prince and the arrival of that peak-level expert of the Sage Realm. The figures of thunder dragons could be seen flashing within the black clouds in the sky. The clouds then spread over the entire imperial capital in a flash. This had alarmed the entire imperial capital. There were many sage experts present in the imperial capital. However, it was still very rare for them to dare to cross a tribulation in the imperial capital. This vast and mighty heavenly power had forced the majority of ordinary people to kneel down. The sage realm was for the sages. The ordinary people simply weren't on the same level. Therefore, they were experiencing a formidable coercion. However, the matrix formation of the imperial capital got triggered by the heavenly tribulation and obstructed those coercions almost immediately. Otherwise, the entire city would have been brought to its knees. The heavenly coercion became increasingly heavy. Even the 4th prince and other sage experts had begun to feel a strong pressure as time passed. In fact, it had begun to impact their souls. They couldn't help but suspect. How could there be such a formidable coercion? One must know that these people had crossed the sage realm tribulation. And, they had already become sage experts. So, how they could feel so much pressure because of a sage realm tribulation? However, they didn't think much into it. After all, they had never seen a great alchemy master crossing the sage realm tribulation. So, they couldn't possibly have any idea about this matter. Whoosh! A loud sound of thunder and lightning streaking across the horizon resounded. A 2-meter-tall lightning man appeared inside the clouds. He wasn't clearly visible. He was clad in the clothes of a warrior. He was holding an iron spear in his hand. A strong sage realm coercion was sweeping out from his body. Everyone was stunned at the sight of this. What the hell was going on here? Was this an abnormal heavenly tribulation? Such words suddenly popped up in their minds. They had believed that this had merely existed in the fables. Or perhaps, the abnormal heavenly tribulations had only appeared in front of the great geniuses or the heavens pride experts of the meteor sect. However, it had appeared in front of them at this time. Could the heavenly tribulation of a great alchemy master be so special? Moreover, it wasn't some ordinary abnormal heavenly tribulation. It was the human form heavenly tribulation. And, such a tribulation was considered the most terrifying among the various types of abnormal heavenly tribulations. Everyone suddenly began to tremble when they saw such a heavenly tribulation. And, a chill ran down their spines. They might have died in one slap if their sage realm heavenly tribulation would have been this human form heavenly tribulation. They wouldn't have said it at the time of their breakthrough, and wouldn't even dare to say it now that they could prevail over this lightning man who was issuing that sage realm coercion. Moreover, the thing that had scared them even more was that this lightning man hadn't appeared alone. Many lightning soldiers had arrived behind him. In fact, they had lined up in rows and columns. Each of them was clad in the clothes of a soldier, and was holding an iron spear in their hand. Their overwhelming and grandiose sage power had ripped the vast sky apart. The surrounding space had also begun to shake. Many cavalries made of lightning were also mixed in that army. The men shouted, and the horses neighed. Afterwards, the hooves trampled the void and opened cracks. And, the sound of vibration proliferated in the surroundings like drum beats. Everyone had started to tremble with fear upon seeing such a terrifying army of several hundred people appearing in the sky. It seemed as if the heaven had sent its invincible troops to purge the disastrous evildoers of the world. There had been similar records in many fables. These lightning men weren't living beings. However, the murderous auras that had emitted from their bodies seemed more frightening than that of any living creature. What the hell is going on? Why do I feel like I have returned to the mythological age, the era of heaven's dominance on everything? Those lightning men look like hundreds of thousands of mythological heavenly soldiers who have arrived to suppress all the evildoers of the world. Yeah. Such a sage realm army is enough to destroy a country. And, this sage realm tribulation has come for just one person. Can the sage realm tribulation of a great alchemy master be so dreadful? My God, it's not surprising that the great alchemy masters are so rare. They are so ferocious. Everyone was in shock. It would have been an enormous disaster for them if these lightning men had appeared in their sage realm tribulations. Moreover, there were so many of them in this one. This heavenly tribulation was enough to scare a person to death. The sage realm army moved while everyone's tongues were wagging. The grandiose army then marched downwards with their thunderous footsteps. Their war cry shook the sky. Their murderous auras proliferated in all directions. The entire world began to boil and shake under these dreadful murderous auras. The experts who were present in vicinity of the 23rd Prince's mansion promptly retreated in a maddened state of mind. They didn't dare to approach the army. They would die very unjust deaths if they approached or provoked the heavenly tribulation, since they would ended up being misjudged as a helper of that person who was about to cross the heavenly tribulations. In fact, these experts would have to run for their lives even if a small team of lightning soldiers branched out. The people of the entire city turned their gazes inside the mansion of the 23rd Prince. They wanted to see which man was crossing such a terrifying heavenly tribulation. However, they were surprised to see that a figure leapt up and burst into that sage realm army even in the face of such a horrifying strength. Everyone was left dumbstruck when they saw such an overwhelming scene. From where had such ferocious man arrived, who was facing such a dreadful sage realm tribulation? He didn't avoid it. In fact, he had dared to dash inside. However, some people felt that it was quite normal. How could he face such a terrifying sage realm tribulation if he was an ordinary person? This scenario wouldn't have been possible to achieve for ordinary people. The more terrifying heavenly tribulation meant that the person would also be exceptionally terrifying. However, they couldn't see this man's appearance very clearly. They could only see the shadow of a slim person who had worn a white robe and a golden dragon mask. Bang! Boundless imposing aura emerged out of Yi Zaiwen's body. It then transformed into a vacuum of the universe. He was standing in the center of the universe. The heavenly forces marched over and broke the void. Their boundless imposing aura pounded down from the sky like a mountain range. Yi Xuan had already burst into the divine army. He then suddenly shot a fist. And, a seemingly endless amount of spirit energies got absorbed by his fist as a result. They then condensed into a huge star. It burst out blinding rays of light which ripped apart the vast sky. The dazzling rays of the light of the star made it difficult for everyone to open their eyes. Rumble. It seemed as if two incomparably dreadful forces had collided with each other. Numerous cracks had appeared in the void. And, they had then proliferated in all directions like spider webs. A trace of chaos had started to leak out. The scene looked incomparably frightening. Crash, two forces collided into each other. And, incomparably dreadful energy waves swept out in all direction from the center of the collision. It formed violent astral winds which began to blow everywhere. In fact, a truth realm expert's bones would have gotten crushed into powder by this incredible shock wave if he hadn't used his protection. Several of those sage realm lightning soldiers had been ripped apart by this dreadful force. They had then transformed into massive lightning energy. Then, they were captured by a force, and transferred into the heavenly source mirror. The heavenly source mirror issued flashes of a bloody light after it had absorbed this mass of energies. Chapter 506, Chapter 506, Chapter 506, Sage Realm. Sage Realm. Translator, Novel Saga Editor, Novel Saga Yi-Mo had sunken into deep sleep. He needed huge amounts of energy in order to recover. This had been an ordeal for Yi Xuan as well. This enormous army of lightning soldiers was like a horrible heavenly punishment for other people. However, they were merely a huge amount of mobile energies for Yi Xuan. This lightning energy acting as heaven's punishment was so dreadful in other people's opinion that they couldn't dare to absorb it. In fact, their bodies would explode if they tried. However, there was no such concern for Yi Xuan since he possessed the mighty, gilded tyrant form. His tyrant body had already reached to the peak of the 6th layer. It was only one step away from reaching the 7th layer. The more he practiced this incredible tyrant body divine technique, the more he felt that it had become profound. It could reach to an extremely terrifying extent. He himself had mended the successive layers of this technique after the 1st layer. In fact, he was confident that his tyrant body technique was more tyrannical than the original version of the tyrant body technique. However, its foundation had been laid by the original version. He couldn't have deduced the successive layers of this power technique if he hadn't obtained the 1st layer. His mysterious space was amazing. He could deduce any power technique to its pinnacle as long as he had enough spirit energy. However, the basic requirement was that he must have a power technique to act as foundation. It was impossible to create a homemade power technique without the foundation. Yi Xuan possessed many incredible magical techniques of secret origins. However, he had only created the observing person scripture by himself. He himself had created the entire technique on the basis of his own comprehension of the hidden star scripture. His mysterious space was indeed incredible. However, it couldn't do everything. It couldn't create a power technique out of thin air. Therefore, this showed that the tyrant body technique was an extremely tyrannical power technique in itself. He might come across another descendant of tyrant body one day, but there was no certainty. Yi Xuan was also determined to take advantage of this heavenly tribulation for completing the transformation and pushing his tyrant body technique to the 7th layer. Moreover, he also wanted to use it to provide Yi Mo the amount of energy that he required. He had already deduced the 7th, 8th, and 9th layer of this technique. However, he hadn't deduced the final 10th layer yet. Yi Xuan had a hunch that his physique would transform in its entirety if he managed to reach the 10th layer. In fact, he believed that he would transform into another being entirely. He would transform into another species. Then, his descendants would inherently have the tyrant body since their births. They wouldn't have to practice to obtain the tyrant body. This would be a complete transformation of the shape of life. However, that would happen after a very long time. The 7th layer of the tyrant body technique would take Yi Xuan's body strength to another level. In fact, he even suspected that the magical abilities might begin to appear in his body after he had practiced the further layers of this technique. Just like those devils and gods in the fables. The existing Tao principles had been founded by them. But, where had they learnt all these from? They had acquired these remarkable abilities naturally. They had possessed a myriad of magical powers since their births. These were the magical powers derived from innate skills. So, there would be no difference between him and those devils and gods once he had practiced the tyrant body to the pinnacle. Then, the magical abilities might appear on their own. However, that was something that would happen in the future. Yi Xuan's first priority was to annihilate this heavenly tribulation. Other people believed that rushing into this divine army was akin to asking for death. However, it was a form of self-defense for Yi Xuan. So what if he would have to face the joint attacks of several hundred sage experts? Perhaps, he would be crushed to death even if he was formidable. However, forcing into that army was different. He could freely attack them in that case because he had his enemies in all directions. So, it wouldn't matter if he were to attack randomly. However, those lightning men wouldn't be able to do so. Moreover, he may be surrounded by several Sage Realm lightning men, but it was still better than facing a barrage of attacks of hundreds of sage experts at once. Yi Xuan hadn't even stridden over, and the world had started to vibrate. His stature was obviously thin. However, he had reversed the flow of the entire world's spirit energies like a god. A dreadful storm swept across, and crushed the void as a result. Yi Xuan moved and raised his hand. A dreadful imposing aura broke out from his body. The golden divinities crawled over his entire body, and fused together with his body. He wasn't afraid while facing such lightning soldiers. His universe also expanded crazily. And, those lightning soldiers had been surrounded by it. He was the only true god in his universe. Roar! 3 lightning soldiers joined forces, and thrust their iron spears. They drew in the lingering Tao principles. It was a terrible sight. These lightning soldiers might not have the strongest strength. However, they had been condensed by the heavenly law itself. So, they could casually grasp the Tao principles, and manipulate them at will to launch attacks. Yi Shiwen shot his fist. It transformed into a huge star which went forward to crush. He had also accommodated his Tao principle into it. A kind of invincible and tyrannical force swept across, and proliferated in all directions. He didn't hold back while facing these lightning men. He didn't have any escape route either. He had realized the intensity of this breakthrough. He would have to climb over this ordeal. And, that's because it would be a dead end for him if he couldn't climb over it. Rumble. This was a stunning blow. Yi Shiwen's fist had transformed into a huge star. It then collided with those iron spears. Dazzling rays of light emitted from the point of the collision. They then proliferated in all directions. It ripped apart the earth, and violently spread in all directions. The space collapsed and terrifying cracks were opened wherever it went. And, it eventually swept out far in the distance. Roar! Those 3 lightning soldiers were suddenly sent flying away within the endless rays of light by Yi Shiwen's attack. They fell down. They were roaring, and weren't willing to back down. They weren't willing to give up their martial consciousness like real men. However, a huge golden hand suddenly stretched out before they could fly up. It then grabbed those 3 lightning soldiers, and crushed their martial consciousness. And then, the big hand clutched into their bodies. A part of their body's energy flowed inside the heavenly source mirror as a result. And, some part of their body's energy flowed into Yi Shiwen's body. The lightning surged over his entire body for a moment. His golden divinities were also flowing over his entire body. Therefore, he appeared like a human-shaped magic weapon in this moment. In fact, he had started to issue an aura so dreadful that it had scared the people. The battle was still going on. The loud heaven-shaking sounds were proliferating in all directions. This had shaken the entire imperial capital. The waves of dreadful aura were sweeping across one after another, and were distorting the space. The experts in the imperial capital wanted to sweep out their divine senses in order to see what was happening. However, the center of the battlefield had been surrounded by countless lightning men. So, they couldn't see anything. The divine senses were unable to reach inside since they got cut off by the endless heavenly power. Someone may manage to sneak in their divine sense. However, they would get injured if their divine sense got discovered by the lightning soldiers, since these soldiers would crush the sneaking divine sense. The spectators trembled with fear every time the heavenly shaking sound resounded. They couldn't imagine what kind of battle was taking place there. However, one thing was certain, such a stunning battle that could scare a person to death. The divine army of 500 lightning soldiers was enough to wreak the entire imperial capital. Even a great sage expert would have been scared to death if he had faced such a dreadful army that didn't fear life or death. They would be in a very difficult situation even if one such lightning soldier had become their opponent. That dwarf tiger possessed the most outstanding internal strength amongst those present on the scene. However, even he had been left dumbstruck when he had seen such a terrifying scene. In fact, he had become numb. After all, what kind of an evil genius was present here? It wasn't that he had never seen an abnormal heavenly tribulation. He had been practicing since thousands of years. So, he must have seen some geniuses cross the abnormal heavenly tribulation. However, he had never seen such a terrifying heavenly tribulation. He could still feel the vast and mighty heavenly power even though he was hiding far away. It felt enormous and grandiose. It seemed as if this heavenly power would chop down anyone who didn't respect the heaven. He had never seen such a heavenly tribulation. Moreover, he couldn't even dare to imagine it. It may be possible for a genius to make a narrow escape after facing an abnormal heavenly tribulation. However, he himself would die 100 out of 100 times if he were to come across such a heavenly tribulation. It was impossible for him to cross this dreadful heavenly tribulation. Therefore, he believed that the man who was crossing this heavenly tribulation was more terrifying than this heavenly tribulation itself. In fact, he didn't even consider this man to be a man. He was some monster to that dwarf tiger's eyes. Time passed second by second. It wasn't clear how much time had passed. It seemed as if a century had passed in every breath. In fact, it seemed as if the world had gotten destroyed and taken a rebirth in every blink of the eye. Even Yi Shiwen didn't know how long he had been fighting with these lightning soldiers. None of these lightning soldiers was a match for him, since most of them only possessed the strength of the initial stage of the Sage Realm. However, he didn't dare to relax, since he clearly knew that he would die if he relaxed even for a bit. It was difficult to assess the extent by which these lightning soldiers would surpass an ordinary expert of same level by. They were ferocious, and unafraid of life or death. Moreover, it was extremely difficult to kill them. They were made of energy in their entirety. So, their bodies simply couldn't die. Only a man like Yi Shiwen could finish the fight within a short time, since he had been forcibly absorbing their energies. However, there were so many lightning soldiers that he had also begun to feel a bit exhausted. The waves of his intrepid aura proliferated in all directions. The tyrant body technique was operating at a maddening potential. A part of the absorbed lightning energies had been channeling into his body, and it had been tempering his body. It wasn't clear how much energy he had absorbed so far. However, it seemed as if the energy inside his body had reached the saturation point. It had reached a critical point. However, his tyrant body technique was still operating crazily. Bang! Yi Shiwen's strength rose to the peak. It then suddenly rushed to a whole new level. The tyrant body technique had finally reached the 7th layer. He suddenly felt that his entire body had been surrounded by a dreadful power. He then effortlessly shot his fist at this realization. And, his fist now contained 10 times more power than before. This was the 7th layer's power. However, he wasn't done yet, because he still hadn't made the breakthrough into the Sage Realm. Yi Shiwen's fighting strength had increased by 10 times after his tyrant body technique had made the breakthrough into the 7th layer. He had been defending himself from these lightning soldiers with care until now. However, he didn't need to do that anymore, because they couldn't injure him now. Bang! 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 An endless number of lightning soldiers were crushed to death by the huge star wherever Yi Shiwen's fist went. This fight had been a bitter struggle at the start. However, it had become a child's play for Yi Shiwen after the tyrant body technique had made the breakthrough into the 7th layer. Those densely packed embodiments of heavenly punishments had been entirely crushed by Yi Shiwen, and were then absorbed by him into his body in a short period of time after his physique's breakthrough. Bang! Yi Shiwen's golden energy soared into the sky. Chapter 507. Of course, it was sage power. Yi Shiwen's body had begun to exude sage power. He had finally entered the Sage Realm. He could feel that a tremendous change was taking place inside his body. His cells and genes were being ripped apart. They were then being reassembled into fundamentally different atoms. This process was evolving him into a completely new kind of life form. It was an entirely different feeling from earlier. A kind of formidable power was seething inside his body now. It had made him so excited that he wanted to look up to the sky and roar. He had finally entered the Sage Realm. However, he could feel that he could blow away a peak-level expert of the Sage Realm if one were to arrive in front of him. Everyone was left dumbstruck as they saw this scene before their eyes. A group of terrifying divine soldiers that could wreak havoc in the entire Great Way State's imperial capital had died at his hands. This feeling was nothing less than watching someone shooting down a spacecraft using a bow and arrow. It was unbelievable and inconceivable. Even a great sage expert would have retreated and fled while facing the joint attacks of these many experts. However, those lightning experts had disappeared at the hand of this man. All of them had died at his hands. Some people had also noticed that Yi Shiwen had skillfully used the tactic of forcing his way into that army. He had cancelled out their numerical advantage by doing that. he had basically reversed the siege on them. Therefore, he only had to tackle 10 or so experts at a time. And he had gradually eroded them bit by bit from within their formation until he killed each one of those hundreds of experts. It was easy to put in words, but not very easy to believe. The spectators would have been annihilated on the spot if they had tried to confront 10 such experts of the sage rank. Yi Shiwen was genuinely abnormal. It wasn't surprising that he had been able to cross such a dreadful abnormal heavenly tribulation. This was extremely terrifying. Is this the typical sage realm tribulation for a great alchemy master? It's not surprising that there are so few great alchemy masters in this world. Yeah. That was extremely terrifying. I didn't expect that I will ever see such a spectacle. He has entered the sage realm, but, just look at his horrifying aura. It doesn't resemble that of a person who has entered the sage realm. Even an expert who has entered the sage realm a long time ago won't possess such a terrifying aura. The complexions of the fourth prince and several other experts had turned green. They hadn't thought that they would see such a terrifying scene. The fourth prince previously hadn't cared even if that person were to be a sage-level great alchemy master. After all, that person would only have been an expert of the initial stage of the sage realm even if he had managed to enter the sage realm. And he didn't think too highly of an expert of the initial stage of the sage realm. Moreover, the great alchemy masters often weren't good at using their fighting strengths. So, he would have forcibly invited him at the right time. However, there was no way could he question Yi Ziwen's fighting strength after he had watched this terrific scene. In fact, it seemed that Yi Shiwen could even beat 500 sage realm experts if he were good at using his fighting strength. This was simply amazing. A trace of killing intention flashed in the fourth prince's eyes as he shouted, "Kill him for me." The fourth prince genuinely deserved to be called as a formidable and ambitious person of his generation. He had realized that it was impossible for him to recruit Yi Shiwen. And his killing intention had arisen immediately afterward. He wanted to kill Yi Shiwen now. He had given any importance to the 23rd prince before. However, he had become a huge threat for him after he had obtained Yi Ziwen's assistance. The fourth prince felt that this was his only opportunity because that man had crossed the sage realm tribulation barely a moment ago. Therefore, his sage body must be in the process of molding. So, it would be at its weakest as a result. Therefore, this was his only chance. Die. The dwarf tiger was the first one to react. He was carrying a huge sword. His killing intention had risen to the peak. In fact, his killing intention had been fixed on Yi Ziwen's body since a while. He was the most important consecrate expert in the fourth prince's faction. However, he felt an enormous threat after he had witnessed the fourth prince's eagerness to recruit Yi Shiwen. And his hostility towards Yi Shiwen hadn't changed from the beginning till now. What great alchemy master! Look how kill you! The scene of Yi Shiwen crossing the tribulation was very terrifying. However, the dwarf tiger wasn't scared. In fact, it was merely a joke to him. He was an outstanding peak-level expert of the sage realm. He would lose his face if he got scared by an expert of the initial stage of sage realm, even though this expert looked somewhat ferocious. The dreadful aura of a peak-level sage expert emerged out. His aura then soared into the sky. And it pounded upon Yi Shiwen as if a galaxy had fallen from the ninth heaven. The space got fractured by every movement he made. He hadn't revealed his terrifying fighting strength in its entirety when he was fighting with that black-clothed old man. However, he had now unleashed it. He had run away from so many enemies of his clan in the past. And he had been living properly so far. Hence, his strength had increased significantly. Moreover, he wasn't some weakling. He was a peak-level sage expert. Yi Shiwen had understood that the fourth prince wanted to launch a surprise attack on him since his sage body was still consolidating. He had realized that the fourth prince wanted to get rid of him. Yi Shiwen didn't escape with the thought of returning after his sage body had consolidated. And this was unlike what others had expected. Instead, he strode forward like a meteor. He took large strides, and approached like a mountain. His vitality condensed into a pillar of energy, and soared into the sky. He arrived in front of the dwarf tiger within a flash. However, he seemed indifferent towards his opponent. His outstanding aura clashed against that dwarf tiger's formidable aura. His might wasn't the least bit lacking. In fact, it was very strong on the contrary. Two incredible auras had suddenly collided in the sky. Endless cracks appeared in the void along with a shattering sound. Bang! Yishuan raised his hand to attack. He brandished his fist, and it pounded like a star. It was a head-on collision. His fist fearlessly swept forward to face the long sword of that dwarf tiger. He unleashed the Big Bang Stardust fist in front of everyone. Those lightning soldiers had obstructed the line of sights of these people a while ago. However, they could see everything very clearly at this time. So, they immediately felt that they had landed into the vast universe. Yishuan was the only god in this universe. He was ruler of this endless void. Let me send you to hell. Great master of alchemy or whatever. I will send you to hell, the dwarf tiger suddenly roared loudly. His whole Bodhis energy condensed in his long sword. It then transformed into a giant dragon and rushed forward. Whoosh! This strike shook the world. The deafening sound of the collision of metals resounded. Yi Zaiwen's fist and the dwarf tiger's long sword firmly collided with each other. And, a huge crack proliferated in all directions from the point of collision. Bang! Those cracks collapsed with a loud bang. And, this exposed the pitch-black dreadful chaos. Everyone was left petrified at this spectacle. The long sword in the hand of the dwarf tiger didn't look extraordinary. However, it was a real sage sword. Furthermore, it was a sage tool with attack power at its forte. However, Yishuan wasn't afraid. He merely used his fist, and rushed straight up. His body had become intrepid to what extent? Many people guessed that Yishuan would be cut into two halves. However, some people also felt that he would have had confidence in himself if he had dared to use his fist to resist. Ah! A scream sounded from the collision. The dwarf tiger was sent flying back from the point of collision. He staggered and retreated several steps. He was forced to retreat in order to neutralize the very large force that his body had been subjected to. The void broke down with each step that he took. The cracks then spread out like giant spider webs. Everyone was surprised to find that the dwarf tiger's small body was covered with blood. It seemed as if his entire body had been fished out from the insides of a blood pit. Poof! Dwarf tiger spouted a mouthful of blood. Then, he coughed out more blood. The muscles of his arms had cracked open since had been holding the long sword with them. Moreover, blood was gushing out from them. His hands had started to collapse inch by inch since they had encountered a strike that carried unfathomably massive impact force. The look in his eyes seemed exceptionally fearsome. His arrogance had collapsed in the collision that had taken place. In fact, he couldn't believe what had happened a moment ago. He couldn't dare to imagine that a peak-level expert of the Sage Realm like himself had been defeated by an expert who had barely entered the Sage Realm a moment ago. He had been sent flying in one move. It had certainly subverted his common sense. How could someone be so powerful that they had defeated him using their strength of the initial stage of the Sage Realm? Everyone had been scared by the sight of this spectacle. This slim figure was extremely powerful. He had used one fist attack, nothing more. The dwarf tiger was regarded as the strongest among them. However, he had been defeated by this person very effortlessly. Everyone was thinking that the entire situation in this contest for the throne had reversed. People hadn't been optimistic about the 23rd prince. However, he had become enormously popular since Yishuan had joined his faction. That 4th prince had been highly popular in the beginning. However, he would lose his popularity and become a trash if the dwarf tiger died. In fact, even his life might be put in danger. It's impossible. I can't accept this, the dwarf tiger roared loudly. The sound of the friction of his bones sounded from his body. His long sword rose even higher in the sky than it had before. He had even begun to grow at a slow pace. His imposing aura had become even more tyrannical than before. The wounds on his body had healed, and had begun to form scabs. Moreover, his height had become almost equal to the height of an average man. Clang! Dwarf Tiger's long sword emitted ice-cold luster as it suddenly fell down. It carried boundless sword energy with it. It pounded upon Yishuan, and it seemed as if a galaxy had fallen from the ninth heaven. Whoosh! Yishuan raised his hand, and a massive fist fell down. It was surrounded by boundless star power. It was exceptionally dazzling. Bang! The portion between Dwarf Tiger's thumb and forefinger got ruptured. His hands had been numbed by Yishuan in a split second. Yishuan grabbed the edge of the sword with his bare hands. He had managed to hold that sage sword with his bare hands. He hadn't even worn any gloves for protection. This long sage sword emitted profound rays of light when this happened. It then struggled to escape from Yizaiwen's hand. However, golden rays of light suddenly burst out from his hands. They then crushed the sword spirit of that sage sword. Ah! The Dwarf Tiger again spouted a mouthful of blood. His complexion had turned deathly pale. However, Yishuan didn't wait for him to react as he slashed the long sword like a lightning. The strike transformed into a cold sword light. This sword light then dropped down to chop the Dwarf Tiger. Puchi! The Dwarf Tiger's body was cut into two halves by the sword light, and blood splashed out. His soul was also annihilated in that split second. That scene was enshrouded in a pin-drop silence as this happened. The sound of breeze resounded in the sky. However, it had a faintly bleak chilliness and mournfulness to it. A peak-level expert of the Sage Realm had died. In fact, he couldn't even resist 2 moves from Yishuan. He had been slaughtered by Yishuan after they had clashed head-on. Chapter 508. This outcome was clearly beyond their imagination. The Dwarf Tiger had seemed incomparably powerful in the beginning. So, nobody had expected that he would collapse at first blow. He was no match for Yishuan. This scene had blown everyone away in a flash. Yishuan was callously looking at everyone. The sage-level sword that was in his hands suddenly swept out. A loud sound reverberated in the sky, and countless sword energies burst out. Everyone was terrified at the sight of this. The buried person's sword had revealed more dreadful might than before. It was undeniable that the current Yishuan didn't care whether the weapon in his hand was a sage tool or not. After all, he had dared to use an ordinary iron sword in a fight with an expert who possessed a sage tool. However, the might of his buried sword's secret would reach an extreme condition if he had a sage sword in his hand. This sage sword issued far more dreadful might in Yizaiwen's hand than it had issued in the hand of the Dwarf Tiger. The radiance of his brilliant swordsmanship nearly covered the entire imperial capital. Bang! 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 Those sword energies struck the subordinates of the fourth prince one after another since they happened to be in the way. They were then transformed into blood fog, and scattered in the sky. This scene had left everyone speechless. They had understood why the fourth prince had wanted to attack when Yizaiwen's sage body was condensing, because that might be Yizaiwen's weakest moment. However, the outcome had been beyond their expectations. He had still killed that Dwarf Tiger and a group of experts effortlessly. The deceased had then transformed into blood fog even though Yizaiwen's sage body was still taking shape. The fourth prince had looked quite calm at first. However, his complexion had turned exceptionally ugly when he saw this scene because Yishuan was coming towards him at this time with that long sword in his hand. The sharp end of the sword streaked across the void, and delimited a huge crack. This crack looked like the one on a neat paper. You! The fourth prince didn't get time to speak. He only saw a cold beam of light. And, his body was then split open in the sky. He had been cut into 2 halves by Yishuan. Even his soul had been annihilated. The outstanding heroes of the Great Way State became silent as they watched this scene. Nobody had dared to step out and speak up for the fourth prince. One must pay a price in this contest for the title of emperor. There was no one who hadn't paid any price. One must face the decisive battle of life or death once they had stepped onto this road of the contest for the throne. And they wouldn't have any escape route because one would land into a deep abyss or a dead end if they'd withdraw even a single step. In other words, nobody would have spoken for 23rd Prince either if he had died today. In short, nobody would have shed tears for him. This reality of this contest was too cruel. However, the 23rd Prince had become very popular with the death of the 4th Prince. He was considered a trash at the start. However, he had suddenly become the hot favorite in this contest for the throne after he had obtained the support of an incredibly powerful expert like Yishiwen. Some people were unequivocal about their stance of protesting against the injustice suffered by the 4th Prince. However, they didn't dare to say anything right now since Yishiwen had displayed extremely terrifying fighting strength. Could they kill a peak-level expert of the Sage Realm within such a short time if they had been in his place? Moreover, this wasn't the most crucial point. The most crucial point was that they had seen Yizaiwen's dreadful heavenly tribulation. A divine army of 500 sage experts had effortlessly lost at his hands. They hadn't been a match for him either. Only an expert at the small perfection level of the Sage Realm could stop him. It wasn't that the Imperial clan didn't have such experts. However, experts of such rank wouldn't participate in this contest for thrones since such experts often took a neutral stance. In fact, there was no need for such experts to participate in this contest. After all, they were at a level where it didn't matter to them who'd ascend to the throne of the imperial capital. Whoever acquired the throne would then try to rope them in. And they didn't wish to break their existing consecration. Therefore, there was no need for them to expose themselves to unusual danger and pull chestnuts out of the fire. After all, everything could be finished if they made a single mistake. Therefore, the people who often took part in the contest for the throne were the ones like the old ancestor Gong Yang since he wasn't too strong. Such people would put everything they had in the contest. Otherwise, they might not advance ahead in their entire lifetime. The so-called martial cultivation required the so-called basic required conditions, namely law, loyalty, wealth, and land. However, these experts were random cultivators with no backgrounds. So, the thing they lacked the most was resources. And, only such contests might help them in acquiring resources that could help them towards cultivating to an even higher level in their lifetime. It seems that the 4th Prince wasn't the most secretive. This unknown 23rd Prince was. He had also said that he wanted to participate in the contest. However, I never expected that he has such profound background, and had concealed such an expert as well. And, that heavenly tribulation could easily scare a person to death. Perhaps, the entire imperial capital might have been destroyed under his heavenly tribulation if he hadn't crossed it. I had noticed that the 23rd Prince had returned along with 2 consecrate experts. And then, another group of people arrived. Moreover, all of them were dressed in similar clothes. So, they must belong to the same organization. He might have obtained the support of some organization. But, it's quite difficult to say which one. Such battle strength is enough to sweep away the consecrate experts of the other princes. The entire imperial capital was talking about this matter. Some people were happy and excited because of the sudden rise of the 23rd Prince. However, some people were worried as well. That was because the 23rd Prince's participation had suddenly made this already confusing contest between the princes even more chaotic. Crap! What happened here? Rays of light flashed in the sky. The wood dragon came out of the void. He was carrying the big head of a person. The head fell down as he came out of the void. That was the head of that commander who was clad in the silver armor. He had obviously lost his life to Wood Dragon in that fight. The Wood Dragon had traveled more than several thousand miles while chasing this chief clad in that silver armor. And, he had eventually killed this seriously injured chief. He had returned only a moment ago. However, he then found out that the atmosphere of the entire imperial capital wasn't very normal. It should be mentioned that the atmosphere had become very intense. Moreover, the residual aura of the heavenly tribulation was still lingering in the environment, and hadn't scattered in its entirety. In fact, this dreadful aura could make a person's soul tremble. This aura was so dreadful that the wood dragon could feel that an incredible heavenly tribulation had occurred here even though it had dispersed a long time ago. However, he didn't know what exactly had happened here. However, he then saw Yi Shiwen holding a sage sword in his hand. Moreover, Yi Ziwen's body still possessed some residual tribulation aura. This clearly indicated that he had made the breakthrough into the sage realm. In fact, some of the tribulation aura hadn't dispersed because his restraint wasn't at its best right now. So, the wood dragon had suddenly sensed it. Fuck me. It's not you who has crossed the heavenly tribulation a moment ago, right? The wood dragon stared at Yi Shiwen. He could see that Yi Ziwen's strength had become far more powerful than before. And, this had left him terrified. One must know that he had always intimidated other people with his strength and innate talent. And, nobody had ever scared him. However, the residual aura of that heavenly tribulation on Yi Ziwen's body had left him terrified. Of course, it was a feeling of heavenly power, a kind of revere that all living things have for the heaven. This was an instinctive reaction. So, he had no control over it either. Yeah. Yi Shiwen nodded. He put his sage sword inside the heavenly source mirror, and allowed Yi Mo to swallow it. Scarlet rays of light emitted inside the heavenly source mirror as a result. And, his entire inner universe illuminated with a scarlet color. In fact, his universe appeared like a sea of blood now. These rays of light were more dazzling than the time when Yi Mo had swallowed the Blood Emperor seal. A pleasant smile appeared on Yi Ziwen's face because he knew that the heavenly source mirror had recovered very significantly. It should be mentioned that it wasn't the heavenly source mirror that had recovered. Rather, it was Yi Mo who had recovered. In fact, the heavenly source mirror hadn't suffered much damage because it hadn't really fought against the phoenix guy. It had only used the energy field to scare the enemy away. So, the one who had suffered damage was Yi Mo. In fact, the heavenly source mirror wouldn't have any issues, and would become easy to use if Yi Shiwen were to make a harsh decision and erase Yi Mo. However, how could Yi Shiwen be willing to erase Yi Mo? Yi Mo had been like a teacher and friend to him for so many years. He had taught many things to him. Yi Shiwen might have died by now if he wasn't there. In fact, he would have died even before he had met that man of the ancient phoenix world. In any case, he would never give up on Yi Mo, no matter what. Crap. What kind of a heavenly tribulation have you crossed? How it can be so terrifying. The wood dragon simply couldn't believe this. Everything had quickly transformed after the heavenly tribulation. Clouds had turned mild, and the wind had become gentle. Even those things that had been trampled down by the heavenly tribulation had begun to recover under the influence of abundant spirit energy. Therefore, it was obvious that a lot of time had passed since the event. However, he could still feel so much residual aura of the heavenly tribulation. So, he could well imagine what kind of a heavenly tribulation Yi Shiwen must have crossed. You're a monster. People say that I'm a monster and whatnot. However, I am nothing in comparison to you, the wood dragon spoke up in a depressing tone. There were several experts of the younger generation in the Northern Dipper organization. And, he had been working with Qing Su since a long time. He simply didn't wish to compare himself with Qing Su. They weren't equal. Qing Su had arrived late, and he had arrived earlier. Moreover, he was almost 100 years older than Qing Su. They were the experts of same generation in many people's opinion. After all, a gap of 100 years for these experts was nothing since they used to practice for nearly endless time. However, he still felt unpleasant since Qing Su had caught up with him even though he had arrived after him. And, he had gotten to see Yi Shiwen. And, he felt that Yi Shiwen was the genuine monster. He became somewhat dejected as a result. You and Qing Su are freaks. I also have the reputation of Heaven's Pride expert. However, I'm nothing in front of you. This isn't good. I will fall far behind you if it continues like this. I will also rush to the enlightening Mind Mountain once this mission ends. And, I won't come out of the mountain until I surpass you. The wood dragon muttered, since the thought of those two monsters had stimulated him. Yi Shiwen couldn't help but laugh. But, he didn't argue with him. Only he himself knew that he wasn't some genius. He didn't have outstanding innate talent. So, he couldn't even dare to compare himself with these geniuses. In fact, he himself didn't know how many times he had made narrow escapes in order to reach this stage. Chapter 509. Yi Shiwen merely laughed in response. He didn't argue with him. Only he himself knew that he wasn't a genius. He didn't possess outstanding innate talent. So, he obviously couldn't be compared with these geniuses. He himself didn't know how many times he had made narrow escapes from death in order to reach up to this stage. He had reached till this stage by fighting against the people, as well as the heaven. The news that Yi Shiwen had killed the dwarf tiger and the fourth prince had spread throughout the entire imperial capital like a gust of wind. The 23rd prince had suddenly become the hot favorite in this contest for the throne. Many people who hadn't been optimistic about him had suddenly begun to favor him in quick succession. Moreover, they wanted to overwhelm him with resources. The 23rd prince's mansion had been a deserted place earlier. But, it had suddenly flooded with the huge crowd. Many people wanted to curry favor with him since he was the most powerful and popular prince at present. The 23rd prince would definitely remember those who had been good to him if he ascended the throne. Suddenly, a lot of people had arrived looking to join his faction even though it had collapsed and disappeared when he had been chased down by the people. Everyone had left him like the rats leave a sinking ship at that time. But, he had suddenly gained the limelight now. So, he had attracted a lot of people as a result. The 23rd prince, Yi Shiwen, Wood Dragon, and several other people who had now become the core members of his faction had gathered in a private room inside the 23rd prince's mansion. We have become a huge force like the big prince, second prince, and other people since we've crushed the fourth prince's faction. And, we've also become an eyesore for many forces. Yi Shiwen swept his gaze across everyone and said. It was 23rd prince's faction. However, Yi Shiwen had become the core figure of the entire faction of the 23rd prince after that day's stunning performance even though he hadn't asked for that. Yi Shiwen didn't care about ordinary affairs. However, they would still seek his advice on big matters. And, they would always get unexpected answers whenever they'd ask him for advice. Conspiracy, military strategy and tactics, government's politics. Yi Shiwen had casually grasped these concepts at his fingertips. So, he would come up with unexpected solutions. Everyone was impressed with Yi Shiwen. They had initially thought that he was only a high-handed hired goon that was trying to play the role of a consecrate expert. However, they hadn't thought that he could also play the role of an advisor. Moreover, he was nearly omnipotent. He could take care of all kinds of things with mastery. The 23rd prince had considered hiring Yi Shiwen as his advisor many times. In fact, he had also promised him that he would make him the prime minister if he succeeded in obtaining the throne in the future. However, Yi Shiwen wasn't tempted by this. So, he had refused this offer. In fact, he gave no margin for discussion on this topic. Yi Ziwen's target was to reach the peak of martial arts. How he could waste his time on these ordinary matters. In fact, he could casually settle these matters without putting much effort. He had stayed in Yi Yuan School's library for a long time in the past. It wasn't that he hadn't studied anything about imperial governance, military strength and tactics, or how to handle government affairs and so on. He had learnt the notes of the renowned experts of older generation by heart. The Great Yu State wasn't as huge as the Great Wei State. However, many a logic were connected and similar. Analogy dictates that one can easily grasp 100 laws if one can master a law. Therefore, it's not the time to resort to high-handed methods anymore. We have already revealed enough strength. Those who want to seek our help can come to us. And then, we must build high walls, stock up a wide range of provisions, and slowly wait to be named the king. Yi Shiwen slowly stated the true words of rebellion. The 23rd prince's eyes shone as if he had gotten the right direction. These words were few. However, they had an intrinsic guiding property. These were few words. However, they were quite effective. He looked even more earnestly at Yi Shiwen. However, unfortunately Yi Shiwen didn't have any interest in becoming his advisor. It wasn't that Yi Shiwen didn't understand the principle of remaining low-key and quietly accumulating strength. However, that old emperor was already taking his last breaths and could die any moment now. So, where was the time to slowly accumulate the strength? One must rope in whoever comes seeking help under normal situation if one doesn't have enough fame and prestige. This was the requirement of the long-lasting battles. It was like the Three Kingdoms periods when the forces of Chao, Sun, Lu, and Yuan had defeated Dongzhuo, and made use of the reputation built on that victory to recruit countless talents. The 23rd prince had already obtained enough reputation and prestige after he had defeated the entire force of the 4th prince. Therefore, the geniuses who were optimistic about him had already arrived. Plus, he had also accepted the majority of the 4th prince's remaining forces. And, his own force had expanded by a considerable margin as a result. He must maintain a low profile in the coming time and bide his time until the right time was upon. It would be difficult to avoid the opposition of other forces if he continued to resort to high-handed methods. And, they would try to get rid of him as early as possible. Standing out wouldn't lead to good fate under every circumstance. The 23rd prince had tried to stand out in the past, but he obviously couldn't do anything else under those circumstances. However, he could have used such a strategy if his fame hadn't lacked that much in the first place. Our new tactic will be to quietly expand our strength. And then, we will calmly wait for the times to change. Yi Shiwen swept his gaze across everyone and said. Everyone knew what this so-called wait for times to change meant. The right time would be when the emperor would die. That would be a huge time of change. The Great Wei state didn't have its crowned prince. So, these princes would also have a chance. The Great Wei state's emperor could have held the power in his hands for at least more than 500 years in accordance with the very long lifespan of the martial arts experts. So, there had been no need to choose the next emperor so early. However, the emperor didn't expect that one accident could lead to the current situation where a group of princes would start fighting for the throne. Yi Shiwen secretly heaved a sigh of relief. Was it that simple to obtain the Northern Dipper organization's support? He must help the 23rd prince in obtaining the throne. Only then would his task be considered finished. Afterwards, the people of the Northern Dipper faction would arrive and take over the control. Then, Yi Shiwen wouldn't need to handle things here. There were many factions within the Northern Dipper organization as well. Yi Shiwen, Wood Dragon, and Qing Su were comparatively closer to each other. They were all in the Northern Dipper, but this area was regarded as the territory of Yi Shiwen and a few other people. So, the other members of the organization wouldn't dare to intrude because of tacit mutual understanding. In fact, Yi Shiwen could also get a share of profits from this territory in the future. And, he was helping the 23rd prince so energetically in planning these things because of this reason only. He would also obtain many benefits if the 23rd prince ascended the throne. And, these benefits would be far more than what was visible from outside. The 23rd prince hadn't accepted a large number of disciples after he had become the hot favorite, unlike what everyone had imagined. On the contrary, he had nearly stopped recruiting forces after he had received the force of the 4th prince. A large number of people were still standing outside the 23rd prince's mansion since they wanted to join his faction. They wanted to take advantage of the current situation since the final result of the contest hadn't come out. And, they wanted to get mixed in his faction during this time. After all, they would at least get to be the emperor's ministers if the outcome got swayed in their faction's favor. However, the 23rd prince's reluctance was contrary to many people's expectations. In fact, some forces of the 4th prince were seeking to join other princes. But, the 23rd prince hadn't stopped them. In fact, it seemed as if he had ignored them in their entirety. However, only Yi Xuan knew the reality. After all, Yi Xuan had established the policies. So, he knew that these people were opportunists and useless. The only thing that could decide the result of this contest for the throne was fighting with the opponents by relying on one's military force. And, these people were useless as a military force. These people would collapse and disappear at the first sight of failure. Thus, they were unreliable. Moreover, there would be no end to these people's greed if the 23rd prince were to mount the throne in the end. They would keep demanding more and more from him. The aftermath of 4th prince's death had quietened down after 1 month had passed. The 23rd prince and many other princes had divided the 4th prince's forces among themselves. The majority of the force had obviously fallen into the hands of the 23rd prince. However, a considerable part of the force had also fallen into the hands of other princes. And, they had also reached their limits as a result. After all, the 4th prince had been operating his forces for over 100 years. So, their foundation was incredibly profound. How would it have been that easy to complete this partition if the backbone of the 4th prince's faction hadn't been broken by Yi Xuan along with the death of the 4th prince himself? However, the entire imperial capital looked even more nervous. Many people were guessing that the 23rd prince's tightly hidden force might emerge all of a sudden. After all, the moment of final announcement was drawing near. No news about the emperor was disseminated inside the imperial palace at first. However, some news eventually came out. Someone had gone and knocked the doors of Imperial City Watchtower for the treatment of the emperor's injury. They had visited and requested the imperial clan's old ancestor of Great Sage Realm to move into action and provide treatment to the emperor's injuries. After all, the emperor's force was bigger than the forces of all the princes. They were the royalist force. They had flourished because of the emperor. They had obtained the love and trust of the emperor. And thus, they had been able to reach till here. The other people wouldn't suffer the biggest loss if the emperor died suddenly. However, these loyalists would. After all, every prince had their own members. So, they would use their own members instead of these old officials of the late emperor if they obtained the throne. And, these old loyalists were mostly worried about this thing. Therefore, it would be better if they could think of a method to treat the old emperor's injuries rather than trying their lucks on whichever prince would win. So, they were clear that the old ancestor of Great Sage Realm would treat the injuries of the emperor in this critical situation. It had been said that this old ancestor of Great Sage Realm was the founder of the Great Wei State. He had disappeared a long time ago. And, he had only reappeared on few occasions when the Great Wei State was in a situation of crisis, and the entire country was about to extinguish. Moreover, it had been said that he used to live in a secret world, and would remain submerged in closed-door training most of the time. However, these people had gone out to look for this old ancestor of the Great Sage Realm in the hope that he would act. However, soon the news spread out that this old ancestor of the Great Sage Realm was also helpless and couldn't treat the injuries of the emperor. And, this news had declared the destruction of the emperor's force. The ambitious princes had begun to become restless as a result. However, another piece of news suddenly got transmitted soon enough. The eldest prince had rushed into the palace in rebellion. He had suddenly led his entire force, and had rushed into the palace. He had then raided the imperial palace in order to seize the throne. And, another piece of news vigorously transmitted soon after that happened. The eldest prince had been defeated. And, the reason for his defeat was that, the imperial palace's old ancestor of the Great Sage Realm had attacked. He had personally attacked and suppressed the eldest prince since he had rushed inside the palace. And, the eldest prince was defeated as a result. A myriad of rumors started to spread around as a result. And, this caused a lot of confusion. Chapter 5:10. The imperial capital was facing turbulent times these days. The quick and drastic changes had dazzled everyone. Nobody could see the situation clearly. It seemed as if they were in a smoke screen. First, the 4th prince had been killed. Then, the 23rd prince had risen to fame abruptly. And the eldest prince had led his troops into the palace immediately after that. However, the great sage ancestor had suppressed him with ease in the palace. No matter how powerful the eldest prince was, he had been suppressed easily by the great sage expert when they had met face to face. He hadn't been able to resist even a bit, and had been suppressed completely as a result. The eldest prince's forces had suffered a stinky bloodbath. This clearly showed the interest of this forgotten old ancestor when it came to keeping the empire stable. The fighting among those princes was one thing. However, daring to invade the imperial palace was a capital offense. It was a dead end. The entire imperial capital had been shaken up. And many forces had also chickened up all of a sudden. The forces that wanted to stir up trouble by taking advantage of this contest among many princes had suddenly gone silent, in particular since nobody wanted to bear the rage of the great sage ancestor. Everyone had become jittery inside the 23rd prince's mansion upon the arrival of that founder of the great sage realm. All forces had restrained their actions no matter whether they were ambitious or not. The 23rd prince's faction wasn't an exception either. They had been warned and prohibited from going out and stirring up trouble. Any issue might trigger the anger of that old great sage at this time. The pending matters of the empire had been quickly resolved after the return of this great sage elder. He was worthy of being called the founder emperor. After all, he had resolved so many pending matters very quickly. So, the empire was back on the right track as a result. Everyone had understood one thing: any military operation had become insignificant with the return of this great sage ancestor. Could these so-called powerful subordinates of the princes contend against a great sage expert? Those ambitious princes were as inexperienced as young chicks in front of this great sage expert. After all, he was the martial emperor of the Wei state. He was the one who had laid the foundation of the Wei state in those chaotic times. So, it was simply ridiculous to compare him with these inexperienced princes. Everyone had understood that it was no longer possible to mount the throne by competing against each other by depending upon their forces. Instead, it was possible only with the favor of the martial emperor of the Wei state. Everything would be pointless even if those princes had a bloodbath. In fact, he might not care even if all of them died. He might randomly extend support to another person from the imperial clan in obtaining the throne. And why wouldn't he? After all of them were his descendants. Perhaps, those courtiers used to differentiate between relatives and strangers. However, all those people were his descendants in his eyes. Then, what's the discrimination between close and distant relatives? The people of the Great Wei state believed that their nation was safe and sound as long as the martial emperor of the Wei state was alive. And, perhaps the entire Great Wei state would collapse and fall apart once he died. This case was similar to the one with the old founders in the Yuan school. Many people believed that he had already died in a seated posture. However, they hadn't expected that he would still be alive after having extended his life with the help of a secret technique. It was a big sacrifice on his part to continue living in the present world. He would have suffered unbearable pain by continuing to live on with the help of some secret technique. One would have to endure pain every day and night if they used this technique. Anyway, it would have been impossible if he didn't have the will of iron and a stone-like perseverance. Moreover, he had endured such pain because he might have to fight for the sake of Yuan school one day. This had left people to admire this senior predecessor. They found him svelte and peerless. Even his last glorious battle was brilliant enough to be written down in the annals of the Yuan school. It had then been spread among the people of all generations. He had appeared very abruptly in the Yuan school in their most difficult time. The senior experts, teachers, and all the fellow students were in danger at that time. The Yuan school was in a hopeless situation. However, he had stood up firmly at that time. He had become the strongest pillar for the Yuan school when it was on the verge of a collapse. Several hundred years of fighting had killed the prestige of the Yuan school. However, he had single-handedly pacified the calamity of the Yuan school. He had led the expeditions of the Yuan school throughout his life. And, he had died leading an expedition of the Yuan school. Even his enemies hadn't dared to disrespect him for this reason. Perhaps, death was also a kind of relief for him. Yi Zaiwen's present strength had surpassed that old founder's from back then. However, he still had respect for him in his heart. At present, things had changed and become simpler for many people of the Great Wei State since the martial emperor of the Wei State had returned. Everything appeared blurred like layer upon layer of blood fog before his arrival. It wasn't even clear how many fights they would have to experience in order to see the outcome. However, everything depended on the decision of Wei State's martial emperor at this time. So, they would have to experience less turmoil now. However, it was a big problem for Yi Shiwen. A great sage expert had interfered. And, this had suddenly left him to feel that he wasn't in a favorable position to use his skills. His former strategy dictated that they would wait for the old emperor to die. Then, they would fight for the throne. And, the 23rd prince could ascend to the throne as long as he could kill those other princes. And, this ascension would be perfectly justifiable. However, who cared about that old emperor's life or death now? It didn't matter whether he was dead or alive. The crucial point was the attitude of the martial emperor of the Wei State. There would be no problem if he supported the 23rd prince. However, what should be done if he didn't? Yi Shiwen also became somewhat frantic while facing this situation. In fact, he had even rashly thought that he would ask the Northern Dipper organization to send a great sage expert. The Northern Dipper organization didn't have too many members. However, there were many great sage experts in that organization. In fact, many great sage experts were even present among the peripheral members. After all, the official members were mostly top-tier Heaven's Pride experts. Therefore, they could at least cultivate up to the perfection level of the great sage realm if they didn't come across any calamity. However, the peripheral members were also a group of geniuses. They weren't some unnecessary people who could be used for dealing with small matters. Nothing can be done in this matter since things have reached this stage. The voice of the wood dragon made a buzzing sound after it passed through the mask as he said this. Initially, there was no problem since Yi Shiwen was keeping watch. However, even Yi Shiwen couldn't do much now. Great Sage, this name was enough to represent everything. Great Sage was considered the pinnacle of power in many big worlds. It was also considered the mainstay of a force. Wood Dragon didn't want other people of the Northern Dipper organization to arrive and interfere. After all, he wanted to run this place of the Wei State as his own nest. The so-called practice was the cultivation of law, loyalty, wealth, and land. He, Yi Shiwen, and Qing Su didn't wish to establish their own secret little force on the side. Therefore, the best way to earn loyalty and resources was to help a force. And, it was a very good option as long as they could reap benefits and wealth at regular intervals. However, they didn't have any other way if the situation had reached that extent. After all, it was still better than the failure of the mission. The wood dragon couldn't help but hold his forehead either. He was quite depressed by these events. Unexpected things had been happening again and again. The 23rd prince has also entered the palace. So, we will soon come to know what the present regulations are. Yi Shiwen was leaning against the edge of a big tree as he said. Breeze blew the hem of his robe. It was a bit cold. He didn't wish to call more people either. The majority of people apart from him and the wood dragon could very well be considered as outsiders. He had also considered that he might attract the attention of the meteor sect if he called more people to get rid of the Wei State's martial emperor. The death of one or two sage experts wasn't a big thing. It wasn't that the sage experts didn't have any importance in the meteor sect. However, they weren't very significant either. But, it would be very surprising if the meteor sect didn't investigate the matter in case a great sage expert were to die here. This was also the reason why this task had been handed over to two inexperienced newcomers like the wood dragon and Yi Shiwen. Many people would have wanted to get such a good task. In fact, there wouldn't have been so many unnecessary troubles if a great sage expert had received this task. Moreover, they wouldn't have required making countless plans like Yi Shiwen. In fact, they would have had only one plan. Kill all those who don't accept their decision. They would have continued to slaughter until the people had started to obey their commands. And, this task would have been complete without hassles as a result. The 23rd prince had been invited to the palace by the Wei state's martial emperor this morning. The other princes who had been fighting for the throne had also been invited along with him. It seemed as if the Wei state's martial emperor was planning to put his cards on the table. He also didn't seem interested in these ordinary affairs and needless entanglements. After all, he wouldn't have left the position of emperor and fled to the meteor sect if that was the case. Yi Xuan hadn't accompanied the 23rd prince. After all, who would dare to assassinate a prince before the eyes of the martial emperor of the Wei state? Therefore, safety was guaranteed. Moreover, Yi Xuan was also afraid of a possible situation. What would happen if the Wei state's martial emperor were to lose his temper and capture the prince? Who would go to rescue him in that case? We must withdraw if there is any issue. Damn it! The mission description never said that there is going to be a great sage expert involved, the wood dragon spoke up in a complaining manner. The worldly affairs are unpredictable. We must be prepared to counter every move as and when they occur. Yi Xuan replied. Suddenly, the sound of hurried footsteps sounded. Both individuals looked towards the gate to see who it was. One must know that both these individuals had honorable statuses inside the prince's mansion. In fact, ordinary people wouldn't even dare to go in the courtyard where these two men used to dwell. Soon, a middle-aged attendant dressed in attendant's clothes arrived in front of both these individuals. He saluted them and said, "Respected consecrate experts, someone is looking for the respectable dragon consecrate outside." Yi Xuan recognized this person. He was a reliable subordinate of the 23rd princes. He was also an internal attendant inside the prince's mansion. It was said that he had been accompanying 23rd prince since many years. He had luckily escaped at the time when the 4th prince had been chased down. And then, he had again returned to prince's mansion, and had taken charge of the internal matters of the mansion. He didn't dare to lack any manners in front of these two senior experts. He also possessed martial arts cultivation. In fact, he possessed the strength of legendary realm. However, he knew that these two senior experts could poke him to death with a finger. Moreover, they had a good relation with his master. And, he himself could go a step further and become a main figure in the imperial palace if his master were to ascend the throne. "Who is looking for me?" Yi Xuan asked. "The dragon consecrate." That's what he was called by people in the prince's mansion to differentiate him among these two. "It's President Jiang. He's the president of the Association of Alchemy Masters of the Great Wei State," the internal attendant replied in a respectful manner. "What does he want?" Yi Xuan frowned. He obviously knew who this Great Wei State's Association of Alchemy Masters was. It was a huge organization that comprised of the alchemy masters of the Great Wei State. The people of this organization could be found everywhere in the entire Great Wei State. A huge portion of this group comprised of alchemy masters. They were very exceptional. They had numerous and complicated contact networks. He knew a bit about this force because he initially wanted the 23rd prince to rope in this force. And, this President Jiang was the president of the Association of Alchemy Masters. He enjoyed a huge reputation in the entire Great Wei State. Nobody dared to underestimate the capabilities of this Association of Alchemy Masters. Many people had received the benefits of the Association of the Alchemy Masters. He had wanted for the 23rd prince to rope in this force. However, they hadn't gotten enough time to act on it. And now, it was them who had come to pay a visit. "I would gladly see you since you've come here to meet me." You're tuning into the Blissful Bookshelf YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.